Hi everyone and welcome back to another video. In this video I'm going to go through every person who has been jailed in England for the offence of murder so far in 2026 from the period January to June of this year, and there are 80 individuals who have been jailed for murder. I'll go through what they did, the name of the victim or victims in the case, the minimum term that they received, and then I'll try and pick out something noteworthy from the case, such as the judge's comments. Welcome to my channel, Andy on Crime, where I talk about high profile criminal cases and other aspects of criminal law in England and Wales. And if you are on other social media platforms and you want to follow me, I am on TikTok. My handle is Andy on Crime 1, and I'm also on Twitter or X, and my handle is Andy on Crime. If you would like to support my channel, then you can become a member and get some exclusive perks. Click the join button down below, or you can click the link in the description or above and sign up with NordVPN, where you can get a huge discount on a range of their plans. And by doing so, you will be supporting my channel. So thank you. With all that being said, let's get into the video. First up is Zoe Treadwell, who was convicted of murdering Joey Johnson and was sentenced on the 15th of January 2026 to a minimum term of 35 years. On the 9th of April 2025, 28-year-old Joey Johnston from Bournemouth was murdered by 36-year-old Zoe Treadwell. At around 2 a.m. on that date, Treadwell deliberately drove her Range Rover into the e-bike ridden by Joey after pursuing him through the residential streets in Bournemouth in Dorset at speeds of over 75 miles per hour. Following the collision, Joey died from a traumatic head injury at the scene. 3 weeks later, another individual called John J. Harrison, who was 25, drove a Mercedes into another e-bike in broad daylight, causing injuries to Joshua Lovell and another individual called Free Jenkins. Joshua sustained multiple fractures, and Free Jenkins required a partial amputation of his leg, though mercifully both survived. During the police investigation, the evidence suggested that the incident involving Joey was a case of mistaken identity, with Treadwell intending to kill her former partner Joshua Lovell. This led police to link the two different incidents after phone evidence revealed that Treadwell had paid Harrison £1,000 to strike Joshua in his Mercedes C180. Treadwell was charged with Joey's murder, and both her and Harrison were charged with the attempted murder of Joshua and causing grievous bodily harm with intent against Free Jenkins. Both pleaded not guilty and stood trial at Winchester Crown Court. On the 4th of December 2025, Treadwell was found guilty of murder, and both individuals were found guilty of the two other offences. Two other individuals who had also been charged were acquitted of charges of murder, manslaughter and attempted murder. On the 15th of January 2026, Treadwell was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 35 years. For his part, Harrison was jailed for 32 years. The judge told Treadwell during sentencing, "You were totally indifferent as to whether Joey Johnson lived or died. You made no attempt to assist him or summon assistance for him." And the judge also stated that Harrison was described as smiling during the pursuit and had been paid £1,000 for his involvement. Next up is Nimalarajah Mathiyaparanam, who was convicted of murdering Nimalarajah and was sentenced on the 16th of January 2026 to a minimum term of 28 years. On the 20th of June 2025, police officers were called to the low-cost food and wine store on Stanley Road in Bootle in Liverpool shortly after 5 p.m. Upon arrival, they discovered 44-year-old Nimalarajah with multiple stab wounds, numbering at least 14, and 4 slash wounds to her body. She was treated and taken to hospital, but succumbed to her injuries a short while later. She had been savagely attacked by her estranged husband, 47-year-old Nimalarajah Mathiyaparanam. Nilani had previously taken out a restraining order against her ex-husband. He was detained by police at the scene, where he was taken to hospital after he ingested an unknown substance, resulting in him spending weeks in a critical condition. Upon his recovery, he was charged with Nilani's murder and possession of a bladed article. He denied the charges, though pleaded guilty to the breach of a restraining order and stood trial at Liverpool Crown Court. On the second day of his trial, he changed his pleas to guilty in respect of both murder and possession of a bladed article. And on the 16th of January 2026, Mathiyaparanam was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 28 years. The judge described the murder as exceptionally cruel and brutal, which subjected the victim to a high level of mental and physical suffering. Next up is Robert Rhodes, who was convicted of murdering Dawn Rhodes and was sentenced on the 16th of January 2026 to a minimum term of 29 years. In June 2016, 53-year-old Robert Rhodes murdered his wife Dawn Rhodes by cutting her throat in the kitchen of their family home in Surrey. Rhodes had found out that Dawn was having an affair and sought about planning her murder over the course of months. He even duped their own child into assisting with the murder, which would later prove to be key in this unusual case. After the killing, Rhodes then cut the child and asked them to stab him in the back so that he could claim that he had been attacked. Rhodes later told police that his wife had flipped like the Hulk and attacked him with a knife following an argument about the end of their marriage. Following the attack, Rhodes was arrested and stood trial for murder at the Old Bailey in 2017, but he was acquitted of murder on the basis of his evidence being backed up by his coerced child. He was freed thinking that he had gotten away with murder. In 2021, the child confessed to a therapist as to what really happened in the room, and this alerted the police to a possible miscarriage of justice. This new evidence from the child, who was under 10 years old at the time of the murder, led to a successful application to the Court of Appeal under the double jeopardy law to retry him. The evidence from the child showed that Rhodes had carefully planned to kill Dawn and had told the child to cause injuries to his back. Dawn was asked by the child to close her eyes and hold out her hands as if she was about to receive a surprise, at which point the child left the room and Rhodes attacked his wife with a knife. He then inflicted injuries on the child and some on himself. The Crown Prosecution Service Appeals and Review Unit made a successful application to the Court of Appeal under the double jeopardy provisions introduced by the Criminal Justice Act of 2003 to quash the acquittal of Robert Rhodes for the murder in 2016 of Dawn and to seek a retrial. In these cases, the Court of Appeal will only grant such an application where there is new and compelling evidence, and it is in the interests of justice to quash the acquittal and order a retrial. On the 16th of January 2026, having been found guilty of the murder after a second trial, Robert Rhodes was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 29 years. Next up is Jeremy Heath, who was convicted of murdering Arlen Shokola and was sentenced on the 27th of January 2026 to a minimum term of 27 years. On the 29th of March 2025, Jeremy Heath murdered 26-year-old Arlen Shokola by driving into him with a pickup truck and trapped him against a tree in Harlow in Essex. Heath was accompanied by two passengers, Joe Jones and Matthew Arnold, who abandoned the vehicle and helped set it on fire in an attempt to destroy evidence of the crime. The trio had earlier committed a robbery at knife point, stealing a black Ford Fiesta that they thought contained drugs or cash, but abandoned it after finding it empty. They then encountered Arlen, who was with two others, when an altercation began, which detectives believed to be about the supply of Class A drugs. Arlen began to flee the scene and was pursued by Heath in the silver Mercedes pickup truck, driving through a bollard onto a cycle path before striking Arland, who suffered fatal rib and spine injuries. Matthew Arnold, one of the passengers, suffered serious injuries during the murder and was hospitalised before he, along with Heath and Jones, were arrested between the 1st and 2nd of April. Heath was charged with murder as well as robbery and possession of a knife and perverting the course of justice. Jones was charged with robbery and possession of a knife, and Arnold was charged with robbery. All three men were convicted on the 26th of January 2026 at Chelmsford Crown Court. On the 27th of January 2026, Heath was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 27 years. Jones was jailed for 4 years and Arnold was jailed for 2 years. Next up is Kieran Humphreys, who was convicted of murdering 7-month-old Archie Woodbridge and was sentenced on the 28th of January 2026 to a minimum term of 21 years. On the 9th of February 2024 in Horton Regis, 7-month-old Archie Woodbridge died after being violently shaken by Kieran Humphreys. That afternoon, Archie was left in Humphreys' sole care at a house in Dolphin Drive, whilst his mother, Saskia Woodbridge, went shopping. Humphreys had only met Saskia and Archie a week earlier, but had gained her trust. Sometime between 3:50 p.m. and 5:20 p.m, he lost his temper and gripped and shook Archie with such force that the baby suffered fatal chest and brain injuries. When Saskia returned shortly after 5:15 p.m, she found Archie blue, unresponsive, and not breathing. Instead of immediately seeking help, Humphreys delayed calling for medical assistance. Archie was also moved to Humphreys' grandmother's in Bromley Gardens before paramedics were called. Humphreys, along with his mother Sharon Humphreys and his friends Karen Smith and Sam Wyatt, then provided a false account to emergency services and police in an attempt to conceal what had happened and to suggest Humphreys was not present when the injuries occurred. Archie was taken to hospital but was pronounced dead at 9:40 p.m. despite medical efforts to save him. The following day, on the 10th of February, Humphreys was arrested on suspicion of murder. Sharon Humphreys and Karen Smith were arrested on suspicion of perverting the course of justice, and Sam Wyatt was arrested a day later on the 11th of February 2025 on suspicion of perverting the course of justice. Following a trial at Luton Crown Court, Kieran Humphreys was found guilty of murder, child cruelty and conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. Sharon Humphreys, Karen Smith and Sam Wyatt had all pleaded guilty earlier to perverting the course of justice. On the 28th of January 2026, Humphreys was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 21 years. Sharon Humphreys was jailed for 9 months, Karen Smith for 12 months and Sam Wyatt for 15 months. Next up is Paul Knight, who was convicted of murdering Isabella Knight and was sentenced on the 29th of January 2026 to a minimum term of 19 years. On the evening of the 12th into the 13th of June 2025, Paul Knight murdered his wife, 32-year-old Isabella Knight. Paul Knight, who was aged 35, lived in Barton Latimer with his wife, their 2 young children, and family dogs. Although they appear to have had a conventional family life, their marriage broke down in 2024. A brief reconciliation in June 2025 failed, and they were sleeping in separate bedrooms while preparing for financial separation. The breakdown was not due to another relationship, but was heavily influenced by Paul Knight's cocaine addiction, which caused financial strain and frequent arguments. On the 12th of June 2025, neighbours heard them arguing about money and his drug use. Overnight between the 12th and 13th of June, whilst under the influence of cocaine, Paul Knight lost his temper and strangled Isabella in her bedroom while their children slept nearby. Medical evidence showed that the attack was sustained, requiring prolonged pressure to her neck to cause death, and she had injuries consistent with a struggle. It was also inferred that he had used a pillow to muffle her as he killed her. He later wrote a suicide note admitting the killing and was arrested after erratic driving and unsuccessful attempts to kill himself. Following his arrest, he answered no comment in police interviews. He was charged with murder, pleading not guilty, but he pleaded guilty to manslaughter at his initial arraignment in court. In December 2025, he changed his plea and pleaded guilty to murder on what would have been the first day of the trial. And on the 29th of January 2026, Paul Knight was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 19 years. Next up is James Byrne, Simon Allen and David Harrison, who were convicted of murdering Jacqueline Rutter and were sentenced on the 29th of January 2026 to minimum terms of 40 years, 28 years and 26 years respectively. Just after 1 a.m. on the 30th of October 2023, a stolen Vauxhall Insignia was driven to 36 Meadowbrook Road in Moulton on the Wirral. Two masked men, including James Byrne, approached the house. When 58-year-old Jacqueline Rutter opened the door, Byrne shot her twice at close range, killing her. Jacqueline Rutter was a grandmother who had struggled with lifelong drug addiction, but she was not involved in gang operations, but she did occasionally buy drugs from the JJ Line gang led by James Byrne. The court found that the killing was an act of revenge after Jacqueline's sons had taxed the gang, stealing drugs and a phone 2 days earlier. The murder was said to have been carried out to restore the gang's reputation in the violent drug trade, leaving her family with lasting grief. The men fled in the Insignia to a pre-arranged location on Garden Hay Road, where they switched into a waiting Ford C-Max. Simon Allen then set fire to the Insignia using petrol he had purchased earlier, destroying the evidence before rejoining the others. The murder had involved significant planning from Byrne, Allen and David Harrison, including reconnaissance trips, coordinated vehicle changes, the use of masks, collection and return of a firearm and the deliberate destruction of a car, and the Ford was later to be scrapped. James Byrne, Simon Allen and David Harrison were convicted of murder, possession of a firearm with intent to endanger life, and arson. Barry Glynn, the driver of the Insignia, was convicted of manslaughter, firearm possession with intent to endanger life, and arson, but the jury were not sure that he intended to really seriously harm Jacqueline Rutter, so was found not guilty of murder. On the 29th of January 2025, James Byrne was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 40 years. Simon Allen was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 28 years, and David Harrison was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 26 years. For his part, Barry Glynn was sentenced to 20 years for manslaughter and a further consecutive sentence of 10 years for possession of a firearm with intent to endanger life, resulting in a total sentence of 30 years. Next up is Joshua Michals, who was convicted of murdering Jia Wang and was sentenced on the 30th of January 2026 to a minimum term of 16 years. On the 20th of March 2024, Joshua Michals murdered 31-year-old Jia Wang. Michals, a 26-year-old American postgraduate film student in London, had met Jia at Goldsmiths in late 2023. They initially formed a romantic connection, though his interest waned. After several months of messaging, they had consensual sex on the 23rd of February 2024. When a condom came off, he persuaded her, despite her sensitivities about medication, to take the morning after pill. Soon after, she developed a rash and became convinced she had contracted a sexually transmitted disease. Despite knowing her anxieties and prior insistence on up-to-date sexual health tests, he refused to get tested and had earlier deceptively sent her outdated test results with the dates removed. Over the following weeks, her distress escalated and she expressed suicidal thoughts. On the 20th of March 2024, Michael went to Zara's flat under the pretense of calming her down. During the 50 minutes he was there, he killed her. Evidence showed that he inflicted 2 serious knife wounds to the face and then strangled her forcefully, causing a fatal neck fracture whilst she struggled for her life. Having murdered Zara, Michals went about deleting their messages, called his father in the United States, and only contacted emergency services about 3 hours later. In police interviews and later statements, he omitted key details about the strangulation and the infliction of one of the wounds, undermining his credibility. At his trial, he denied murder, stating that she had confronted him with a knife, causing him to defend himself. This was rejected by the jury, who found him guilty of murder. On the 30th of January 2026, Joshua Michals was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 16 years. The judge concluded that he had become enraged and lost control, leading to Zara's death. Next up is Deng Majek, who was convicted of murdering Rhiannon White and was sentenced on the 30th of January 2026 to a minimum term of 29 years. On the 20th of October 2024, at around 11:20 p.m, Rhiannon White, an employee at the Park Inn Hotel which housed asylum seekers, was waiting alone on a station platform at Bescott Stadium in Warsaw after finishing work. Majek, an asylum seeker and a hotel resident, followed her from the hotel to the station armed with a Phillips head screwdriver. He launched a frenzied and sustained attack, stabbing her 23 times. 19 wounds were to her head. Rhiannon bravely tried to defend herself but collapsed. She was on the phone at the time to a friend during the attack, and Majek took her phone, switched it off, and later threw it in the River Tame. Majek then brought beer and was seen on CCTV laughing and dancing in the hotel car park whilst emergency services responded nearby. Rhiannon was found by train staff shortly thereafter, but died in hospital 3 days later. The evidence against Majek, including CCTV and DNA, was overwhelming, though he denied responsibility and offered no explanation. Victim impact statements read during sentencing described Rhiannon as a loving mother and valued family member whose death devastated her family. Although Majek claimed to be younger, an age assessment was determined that he was likely born in 1998 and was about 26 at the time of the murder. This would have significantly altered the sentence had he found to have been under 18 at the time of the murder, as he claimed. On the 30th of January 2026, Majek was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 29 years. First up is Polly Murphy, who murdered James Self and was sentenced on the 5th of February. On the 8th of November 2023, 42-year-old Polly Murphy murdered her partner, 47-year-old James Self. The incident happened after she attacked him in a hotel room in Hartleybrook Road in Clacton. This assault was the culmination of weeks of a sustained campaign of abuse endured by James at the hands of Murphy, who was described as increasingly volatile in the weeks leading up to the murder. The attack itself lasted around 2 hours, during which time she punched, kicked and stamped on James. CCTV footage recorded Murphy leaving the room alone while James remained motionless inside. Murphy did not call for help for about 18 hours, eventually phoning paramedics and misleading them that James might have broken a leg, even though his injuries were far more severe. James was taken to hospital alive, however he sadly died in hospital over a month and a half later on the 21st of December 2023. Murphy was initially charged with causing grievous bodily harm with intent, but following James's death she was charged with murder. She pleaded not guilty and stood trial at Chelmsford Crown Court beginning in November of 2025. During the trial, text messages were shown to the jury which displayed the extent of Murphy's attempts to control James. He also had injuries that dated back to previous assaults by Murphy prior to the fatal attack. After a 4-week trial, Murphy was found guilty of James's murder and was sentenced on the 5th of February 2026 to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 15 years. Next up is Adedapo Adegbola, who murdered Stephanie Irons and was sentenced on the 5th of February. In October of 2025, 40-year-old Adedapo Adegbola murdered 23-year-old Stephanie Irons, a psychology graduate and former colleague of Adegbola. The murder took place at Stephanie's home on Westdale Lane West in Mapley in Nottingham on the 22nd of October 2025. Adegbola and Stephanie had been in a brief relationship which had ended shortly before the incident. Prosecutors later told the court that Adegbola had become obsessed with Stephanie and was unwilling to accept the breakup. On the evening of the attack, he visited her address and fatally stabbed her, inflicting multiple injuries, including a wound to her neck. Emergency services were called after Stephanie's colleagues raised concerns about disturbing messages sent from her phone and her failure to then answer her door. When officers entered, Stephanie was found seriously injured and was later pronounced dead at the scene. The fatal injury was a knife wound to her neck which had cut her jugular vein. After the attack, Adegbola fled the scene, having sat on Stephanie's sofa as she lay dying on the floor. He had locked the door behind him and had left a trail of evidence in the streets of Mapley and nearby Carlton. Adegbola then discarded various items, including his shoes, his shirt, and got rid of Stephanie's keys and her phone. He was seen on the CCTV footage wiping blood off the knife and was seen to cut himself severely on his arm. The knife was then found nearby, secreted or thrown into bushes. He later surrendered himself to police the following day. He pleaded guilty to murdering Stephanie, and on the 5th of February 2026, Adegbola was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years. The judge said during sentencing to Adegbola that your controlling behaviour led her to end the relationship. What is plain is that you were not prepared to accept that. Next up is Robert Richens, who murdered Rachel Vaughan and was sentenced on the 6th of February. Robert Richens, a 35-year-old man from Oxford, murdered his former partner Rachel Vaughan at her home in Abingdon in Oxfordshire in May of 2025. The couple had previously been in an on and off relationship. In the early hours of the 30th of May 2025, Richens carried out a violent assault on Rachel inside her home on Sherwood Avenue. During the attack, he repeatedly punched, kicked and stamped on her, inflicting extensive injuries. The assault caused catastrophic injuries, including multiple rib fractures and a traumatic brain injury. Despite the severity of her injuries, Richens did not immediately seek help for her. Instead, he remained at the property for several hours after the assault. At approximately 6:26 a.m. on the 30th of May, Richens telephoned police and told the call handler that he had done something quite serious, saying, "You're not going to believe this, and I think I accidentally killed someone. She's not moving. I am being honest because I am ashamed of what I have done. I did not mean to kill this person." Emergency services attended the property, but despite the efforts of police and paramedics, Rachel was pronounced dead at the scene. Richens was arrested later that day. He was subsequently charged with murder, and the case proceeded to Oxford Crown Court. During the investigation, body-worn camera footage captured shortly after his arrest showed Richens expressing concern that he would miss the forthcoming release of the video game Grand Theft Auto 6. In December of 2025, Richens pleaded guilty to the murder of Rachel. On the 6th of February 2026, Richens was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 16 years. Next up is Stephen Wright, who murdered Victoria Hall and was sentenced on the 6th of February. Known as the Suffolk Strangler, Wright had previously been accused of murdering 5 other women in Ipswich in December of 2006. He was found guilty of all 5 murders on the 21st of February 2008 and was sentenced to a whole life order, meaning that he would never be released from prison. This case relates back to 1999, prior to those murders. In the early hours of the 18th of September 1999 in Felixstowe, Stephen Wright attempted to abduct Emily Doherty as she walked home after becoming separated from her friends and her husband. She managed to escape by banging on a couple's door who called the police. The judge later concluded that had the abduction succeeded, she would likely have been killed. Later that same night, Victoria Hall, who was 17, went out with her friend after finishing work. After leaving the Bandbox nightclub and getting food, the two parted ways near their homes at about 2:20 a.m. That was the last time that Victoria was seen alive. 5 days later, her naked body was discovered in Creting St. Peter, around 25 miles away. Expert evidence showed that she had been abducted and killed within a short time, dying from asphyxiation. The case went cold before it was reopened in 2019 after new information and advances in forensic techniques. As a result of this, Stephen Wright was arrested in prison in 2021 on suspicion of the killing of Victoria before being charged in May of 2024 with the murder and kidnap of Victoria and the attempted kidnapping of Emily Doherty. DNA evidence confirmed that Stephen Wright had sexually assaulted or raped her before murdering her. He was due to stand trial at the Old Bailey in London, but on the 2nd of February 2026, at the start of the trial, he changed his plea to guilty. On the 6th of February 2026, Wright was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 40 years. Due to Wright already serving a sentence of a whole life order, the latest sentence does not have any practical impact other than providing justice for Victoria's family. Next up is Jobie Tyers and Michael Mulvana, who murdered Indrit Mustafi and were sentenced on the 6th of February. On the evening of the 23rd of November 2024, Jobie Tyers and Michael Mulvana carried out a violent attack at a bedsit in the Haxby Road area of York. The two men, wearing face coverings and armed with weapons including a crowbar, had travelled to the property intending to rob those inside of drugs and money. Prosecutors later described the incident as a pre-planned robbery which escalated into a fatal attack. Inside the flat were 3 people, including 26-year-old Indrit Mustafi, originally from Albania but living in Bradford. After forcing entry to the property, the attackers subjected the occupants to what the court later described as overwhelming violence. During the confrontation, the assailants seized a machete that was present in the flat and used it to repeatedly stab and slash Indrit. Indrit sustained multiple stab wounds, including a fatal injury that severed a major artery. Despite efforts to save him after emergency services were called, he died from his injuries. A man and a woman who were also inside the property suffered serious injuries during the attack, but later recovered. Tyers and Mulvana fled the scene after stealing money and other items. North Yorkshire Police launched a major investigation immediately after the killing. The two suspects were identified and arrested within a day of the attack and charged with murder, robbery and serious assault offences shortly thereafter. The case later proceeded to trial at Leeds Crown Court. During the trial, the jury heard that the defendants had planned the robbery and had waited near the property before entering. Tyers admitted the offence of robbery but denied murder, while Mulvana denied all of the charges. After a 3-week trial and several hours of deliberation, the jury found both men guilty of murder and the other offences. On the 6th of February 2026, the judge sentenced both men to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 28 years. The judge said that the attack was a robbery carried out for gain and involved extreme violence towards all 3 victims. He noted the devastating impact of Indrit's death on his family, telling the defendants that their actions had taken a life and caused lasting suffering. Next up is Kian Moulton, who murdered Leo Ross and was sentenced on the 10th of February. On the 21st of January 2025, 12-year-old Leo Ross was walking home from school through the Tritterford Mill Park in Hole Green in Birmingham. While travelling through the park, Leo encountered 14-year-old Kian Moulton, who had been cycling around the area that afternoon. During the encounter, Moulton produced a knife and stabbed Leo in the stomach. The attack was described by investigators as sudden and unprovoked. After the stabbing, Moulton discarded the knife in bushes near a stream in the park. He then approached a passer-by and asked them to call the police, claiming that he had discovered Leo injured. When officers arrived, he repeated this account, presenting himself as a concerned witness rather than the attacker. Leo was taken to hospital, but sadly he died later the same day due to his injuries. Detectives began a large-scale investigation, examining extensive CCTV and doorbell footage from the surrounding area. The footage showed Moulton cycling in the park shortly before the attack and helped identify him as the main suspect. Police arrested Moulton at his home address following the investigation. During police interviews, he gave no comment responses and offered no explanation for the attack, although he repeatedly told officers that they would not find the knife that he had used. The case was later brought before Birmingham Crown Court. Moulton pleaded guilty to the murder of Leo, and the court also heard that he had carried out a number of other violent assaults in the days preceding the killing, including attacks on elderly women. Prosecutors described the murder as a random act of violence against a child who had simply been walking home from school. On the 10th of February 2026, Moulton was sentenced to detention for life with a minimum term of 13 years. The judge described the killing as horrific and shocking, and they later lifted reporting restrictions, allowing Moulton to be publicly identified due to the seriousness of the offence and the public interest in the case. Next up is Anna Podedworna, who murdered Isabella Zabloka and was sentenced on the 11th of February. Anna Podedworna had known Isabella Zabloka since childhood and later began a relationship with her after she separated from her husband. They moved from Poland to England in 2009, settling in Derby, where she worked steadily whilst Isabella's sporadic employment and alcohol use caused growing tension. Their relationship was volatile and sometimes violent. Podedworna claimed that 2 or 3 weeks prior to Isabella's murder, Isabella had tried to strangle her. The exact date of Isabella's murder is unknown, but it was concluded that she was killed before the 31st of August 2010, when Podedworna had gone on holiday. These circumstances of Isabella's death were also unknown, due to what Podedworna did to Isabella after she had killed her. After killing Isabella, Podedworna dismembered her body, cutting it in half with significant force and placed it in bin bags. She then buried them in a pit nearly a metre deep in the garden of their home, later concreting over the area to conceal the crime. She cleaned the house, removed Isabella's belongings, lied to her family and the police about her disappearance, and continued her life, starting a new relationship and having children. For years she maintained the deception, including misleading journalists and a Polish missing persons organisation. In May of 2025, as scrutiny intensified, Podedworna contacted police and admitted killing Isabella, but falsely claimed self-defence. She stood trial at Derby Crown Court for the charge of murder, and on the 10th of February 2026, a jury rejected her claims that she had killed Isabella in self-defence, finding instead that in late August of 2010 she murdered her in anger and frustration during an argument. On the 11th of February 2026, Podedworna was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 21 years. Next up is Ryan Walsh-Westhead, who murdered Ricky Berry and was sentenced on the 16th of February. I've previously covered this case in an earlier video where 3 other individuals, Adam Williams, Michael Smith and Connor Walsh, were sentenced on the 18th of February 2025. On the 17th of July 2024, Ricky Berry, who was 36, was shot outside of his home on Quarryside Drive in Kirkby in Merseyside. The attack occurred at around 6:30 p.m. when a balaclava-clad gunman riding an electric bike fired multiple shots at Ricky in what was described as a targeted drive-by shooting. Ricky was struck several times by gunfire and suffered fatal injuries to his chest. Emergency services attended the scene and paramedics attempted to treat him, but he died shortly afterwards. The shooting was part of a coordinated attack involving several individuals travelling together in vehicles, those being Adam Williams, Michael Smith, Connor Walsh, as well as Ryan Walsh-Westhead. Investigators determined that the electric bike carrying the gunman had been travelling in tandem with a car containing the other suspects. The attack had been planned and carried out by a group acting together. Ricky's death prompted a major murder investigation by Merseyside police. This led to the arrest and conviction of Williams, Smith and Walsh after they were sentenced in February of 2025. Ryan Walsh-Westhead was later identified as another participant after detectives uncovered doorbell footage showing him discussing the killing shortly after the attack. Walsh-Westhead was arrested in July of 2025 and charged with murder and possession of a firearm with intent to endanger life. At Liverpool Crown Court, the jury heard evidence linking him to the planning and execution of the shooting, and he was subsequently convicted. On the 16th of February 2026, Walsh-Westhead was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 27 years. Next up is Jackson Uwagboe, who murdered Robert Robinson and was sentenced on the 19th of February. Now, I've previously covered this case in an earlier video where 2 other individuals, Ryan Wedderburn and Kirk Harris, were jailed for murder in May of 2025. This case concerns a 3rd individual named Jackson Uwagboe. On the 6th of June 2024, police were called to a stabbing in Deptford at around 22:35. A man named Robert Robinson was found with 12 stab wounds, including defensive injuries, and died at the scene despite paramedics' efforts. Earlier that day, Uwagboe had robbed a 17-year-old boy of his bicycle and phone on Deptford High Street. Robert was amongst a group of people who went to the home of Uwagboe's associate, Ryan Wedderburn, hoping to recover the bike and find the thief. When no one answered, the group left, and some members reportedly damaged 2 cars belonging to the Wedderburn family. Soon after, Uwagboe left the property with Wedderburn and Kirk Harris, all armed with machetes. They encountered Robert nearby in Carrollton Way, and Robert ran but was chased, overpowered and fatally stabbed at least 12 times. The 3 attackers fled, with investigators later using CCTV footage, phone records, bank data and other methods to track the suspects. Uwagboe fled to Lagos in Nigeria the day after the murder, but returned to the UK on the 25th of February 2025 when he was arrested at Gatwick Airport. Uwagboe denied the murder of Robert and stood trial before he was convicted on the 10th of February 2026, and on the 19th of February 2026 he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 21 years. Next up is Mark Shorthouse, John Wise, Ryan Stanley and an unnamed 17-year-old boy who murdered Matthew Adams and were sentenced on the 23rd of February. On the 19th of March 2023, Matthew Adams, who was 33 and a father, was attacked outside a pub following a family celebration in the West Midlands. Adams had become involved in a confrontation with a group including Shorthouse, Wise, Stanley and the teenage boy. During the incident, the group surrounded Adams and subjected him to a sustained assault. He was repeatedly punched and kicked both outside the pub and in a nearby car park. The attack caused severe injuries, which later proved to be fatal. Emergency services were called, but Matthew later died as a result of his injuries inflicted during the assault. Police launched an investigation, including reviewing CCTV footage and interviewing witnesses who had seen the attack. The 4 defendants were subsequently charged with murder and violent disorder. The case proceeded to trial, where the jury heard evidence describing how the defendants had collectively taken part in the assault that had resulted in Matthew's death. Victim impact statements were read, describing the loss suffered by his family. On the 23rd of February 2026 at Wolverhampton Crown Court, Shorthouse, Wise and Stanley were each sentenced to life imprisonment with minimum terms of 15 years. The teenage defendant was sentenced to detention for life with a minimum term of 7 years. The judge described the attack on Matthew as a sustained and brutal group assault. Next up is Mohammed Rahman and Hamza Khan, who murdered Craig Dean and were sentenced on the 24th of February. Hamza Khan and Mohammed Rahman were involved in a drug-dealing operation in suburban Birmingham known as the Ace Line, supplying heroin and crack cocaine. Their customer, Craig Dean, known locally as Yankee, had sometimes directed other users to buy drugs from them. On the 7th of July, a dispute arose after Craig directed a user to a different dealer, which led to him being murdered by both men. The court later found that the attack that followed was motivated by the pair's desire to maintain control over their customers and not by any provocation from Craig. After spotting Craig in Springfield Road, both men got out of their car and confronted him. A brief struggle occurred involving pushing and shoving, but Craig had no weapon. He fell to the ground, where the 2 men repeatedly kicked him in the head at least 5 or 6 times whilst he offered no resistance. The attack was intended to cause really serious harm and resulted in fatal injuries. The men showed no concern afterward, continuing dealing drugs and trying to conceal evidence. After learning that Craig had died on the 9th of July 2025, both men attempted to avoid arrest, with Khan hiding in Worcestershire and Rahman fleeing to Bangladesh. Khan was arrested on the 16th of July whilst at a rental property in Worcestershire, whilst Rahman was arrested at Heathrow Airport when he returned to the UK on the 25th of July. Both men stood trial at Birmingham Crown Court and were found guilty of murder on the 30th of January 2026. On the 24th of February 2026, Rahman was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 17 years and 6 months. Khan was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 17 years. Next up is Deividas Skebas, who murdered Lilia Valutite and was sentenced on the 25th of February. On the 28th of July 2022, 9-year-old Lilia Valutype was playing with a hula hoop in the street outside of an embroidery shop where her mother worked. For reasons which are still unclear, 26-year-old Skebas approached her in the street, pulled out a knife and stabbed her once in the chest, piercing her heart. Despite attempts by an off-duty police officer and medical staff to save her, Lilia died at hospital later that evening. Skebas was arrested 2 days later and admitted stabbing Lilia. Earlier in the proceedings of this case, he was found to have been suffering from a mental illness and was initially deemed unfit to stand trial, leading to a trial of the facts in 2023, where a jury determined that he had carried out the killing and he was given an indefinite hospital order, which saw him detained at Rampton Hospital until such time as he was deemed fit to stand trial. When he was deemed fit, criminal proceedings went ahead. Skebas pleaded guilty to manslaughter by way of diminished responsibility, but denied murder, claiming schizophrenia and delusions had influenced his actions. However, prosecutors argued that the attack was deliberate, noting that he had bought the knife 2 days earlier. In February of 2026, a jury at Lincoln Crown Court convicted him of murder, rejecting his defence of manslaughter by way of diminished responsibility. On the 25th of February 2026, Skebas was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years. Next up is Tony Devenport, who murdered Stephanie Blundell and was sentenced on the 27th of February. In July 2025, Tony Devenport murdered his partner Stephanie Blundell, who was 41, at the home that they shared on Canal Street in Chester. The couple had met about a year earlier whilst both receiving support for alcohol addiction. Their relationship was described as stable when sober, but Devenport became controlling and violent when intoxicated. In the days before her death, Stephanie was effectively confined to the house, did not have a key, and had limited contact with others. Evidence showed that Devenport had fed her mainly vodka and ice lollies when she was unwell and increasingly vulnerable. Over the day or two before she died, Devenport carried out repeated assaults on her, including beating and strangling her twice. She suffered more than 100 injuries, including facial bruising, brain trauma, and fractures associated with strangulation. She died on the 20th of July 2025 from a cumulative effect of these injuries, worsened by chronic alcoholism. Stephanie's father discovered her body on a blood-soaked mattress after visiting the house to check on her welfare. Devenport, who was intoxicated, reportedly told him, "I think she's dead." Despite the severity of her injuries, he had not sought medical help and later falsely claimed that she had died peacefully due to alcohol problems. After a 16-day trial at Chester Crown Court, Devenport was convicted of murder, and on the 27th of February 2026, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years. First up is Sharaz Ali, who murdered Bryony Gawith and her 3 children, Dennisty, Oscar and Aubrey, and was sentenced on the 6th of March. On the 21st of August 2024, Sharaz Ali murdered Bryony Gawith and her 3 children after setting her home on fire. The background to this case was a prolonged and abusive relationship between Ali and Antonia Gawith, who was Bryony's sister, which ended in August of 2024 when she left him. Motivated by jealousy and anger, Ali became increasingly threatening, sending messages disclosed in court that revealed hostility towards Antonia, her family, and particularly her sister Bryony. Ali formed a plan to take revenge by attacking the house where Antonia was staying after blaming others for the breakdown of their relationship. In the early hours of the 21st of August 2024, Ali enlisted the help of an individual called Callum Sunderland. Together, they obtained petrol and travelled to Bryony's home in Bradford. Sunderland assisted by acquiring the fuel and kicking in the front door before fleeing, while Ali entered the house, poured petrol inside, and set it alight. At the time, Bryony and her 3 young children were inside, along with Antonia, who managed to escape. In her evidence, Antonia told jurors that she had confronted Ali and tried to wrestle the canister and lighter from his hands before running outside in an attempt to lure him out of the house. The court heard that he tried to get upstairs but was confronted by Bryony and forced back down, where he hit the lighter, igniting the petrol and setting himself and the house on fire. Bryony and her 3 children, who were asleep upstairs, were unable to escape. Ali, who had claimed that he intended to take his own life in the fire, was seriously injured and suffered burns to 80% of his body. Medics initially believed that he would not survive after he was placed in an induced coma for 4 months, though he did recover. Both Ali and Sunderland were arrested and charged with murder. A third individual called Mohammed Shabir, who was said to have driven Ali and Sunderland to Westbury Road, died of a heart attack whilst in prison on remand. Following a trial at Doncaster Crown Court, Ali was convicted of murder. Sunderland was acquitted of murder but convicted of manslaughter. On the 6th of March 2026, Ali was sentenced to life imprisonment and was given a whole life order, meaning he will never be released from prison. Sunderland was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 18 years. Passing sentence, the judge said that there was a substantial degree of premeditation and planning behind the attack, and that Ali had seen the 3 young children as acceptable collateral damage in his plot to wipe out a whole family. Next up is Zara Arsalan, who murdered Harleen Baines and was sentenced on the 12th of March. On the 23rd of July 2020, 2-month-old Harleen Baines was killed by her mother, Zara Arsalan, at her home in West Bromwich. At the time of the fatal incident, only Arsalan and Harleen's father, Jadinder Baines, were present in the property. The background to this case showed that the relationship between the parents had become unstable, with prior incidents involving the police and concerns about alcohol use, but there was no evidence that they jointly harmed Harleen. Medical evidence showed that Harleen suffered extremely severe injuries, including multiple skull fractures, brain bleeding, rib fractures, and other trauma inconsistent with an accidental fall. She had also sustained a rib fracture days earlier from rough handling. The court later found that the fatal assault occurred in a sudden loss of temper, likely triggered by stress and the baby crying. The violence was described as ferocious, involving shaking and forceful impacts against a hard surface, causing catastrophic and ultimately unsurvivable injuries. Harleen fell into a coma and died the following day despite emergency treatment. After the incident, Arsalan gave a series of false and conflicting accounts to police. Initially, she claimed Harleen's injuries were caused by an accidental fall. Later, she falsely accused the child's father, who by that time had died, of carrying out the assault. She was arrested and charged with murder. At her trial at Coventry Crown Court in February of 2026, the court found Arsalan's various accounts were deliberate lies designed to avoid responsibility. The jury concluded that the murder of Harleen was not premeditated, but occurred in a moment of rage, aggravated by the extreme vulnerability of Harleen and the abuse of trust by her mother, who had been the primary caregiver. On the 12th of March 2026, Arsalan was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 19 years. Next up is Dorin Ciorba, who murdered Osaraton Ornsay and was sentenced on the 19th of March. On the 5th of July 2025, Osaraton Ornsay was murdered by Dorin Ciorba, a construction worker who had previously carried out jobs for him, and they had developed a friendly, trusting relationship. In mid-2025, a financial dispute arose after Ciorba received insurance money that he was supposed to pass on to Osaraton, but instead he spent it. Arsalan repeatedly chased him for repayment, creating tension between them. On the 5th of July 2025, Ciorba went to Arsalan's home in Dartford under the guise of carrying out further work, gaining entry through that prior relationship of trust. Once inside, Ciorba attacked him in a prolonged and extremely violent assault. Arsalan suffered multiple injuries, including blunt force trauma to the head, stab wounds inflicted with scissors, one of them penetrating his jugular vein, and was subjected to manual strangulation and strangulation using tightly applied cable ties. The court later found that Arsalan survived for a period during the attack and endured significant fear and suffering. It was concluded that Ciorba tortured him in order to obtain bank PIN and passcodes before ultimately killing him. Arsalan was found dead a day later by his wife. After the murder, Ciorba stole Arsalan's wallet, phone, keys and bank card, locking the house behind him as he left. He then used the stolen cards to withdraw cash and make purchases, having effectively carried out the killing in the course of a robbery for financial gain. Although the judge could not be certain that the murder was planned in advance, it was clear that Ciorba formed an intention to kill during the attack. His later attempts to blame others and portray Arsalan negatively were rejected as false, and the killing was described as brutal, senseless, and carried out against a man who had shown him trust and kindness. Ciorba was found guilty of murder following a trial at Maidstone Crown Court on the 12th of February 2026. Ciorba was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 32 years. He was also sentenced to a concurrent sentence of 13 years for the robbery that also took place. Next up is Joanne Maxwell, Liam Donlin and Amy Clegg, who murdered Paul Scott and were sentenced on the 20th of March. In the early hours of the 22nd of June 2025, Joanne Maxwell and her two adult children, Liam Donlin and Amy Clegg, murdered 37-year-old Paul Scott after he was fatally stabbed. The murder of Paul, who was a distant relative of the trio, followed a grievance that had developed after an earlier altercation involving Maxwell. Motivated by revenge, Maxwell, Donlin and Clegg formed a joint plan to confront and seriously harm Paul Scott. On the 22nd of June 2025, they armed themselves with kitchen knives taken from their home and travelled by car to Paul's address in Blackburn, having first discussed and coordinated their actions. On the way, Donlin was sending audio messages in the presence of Maxwell and Clegg, bragging to others how he was going to attack, kill and chop up those responsible for assaulting his mother. He also said he was going to film it and put it on social media. On arrival at around 3:30 a.m, Clegg played a key role by luring Paul to the front door, knowing he would not open it for others due to prior hostility. When Paul answered the door, Donlin immediately stabbed him in the chest with a large kitchen knife, penetrating his heart and causing rapid death. After the murder, the group attempted to conceal their involvement. Clegg made a call to emergency services using a false identity. And when the police arrived, all three claimed that they had found Paul like that and didn't know what had happened to him. 2 knives were recovered from Paul's sink, and a third knife was recovered from the car that they had all travelled in. Paul's blood was later found on one of the knives from the sink. All three were arrested and made no comment in their police interviews. Maxwell and Clegg did give brief prepared statements, denying any involvement or knowledge. Once before the court, due to the wealth of evidence, Donlin accepted that he had killed Paul and had possession of a knife, but claimed that he had no intention to seriously harm him by denying the act of murder. Following a trial at Preston Crown Court in March of 2026, Donlin, Maxwell and Clegg were all found guilty of murder and possession of a bladed article. Following the jury's verdict, the judge concluded in his sentencing remarks that this was a planned, revenge-driven attack carried out as a joint enterprise, with each defendant playing a distinct but essential role in the killing. The murder was therefore characterised as a coordinated and premeditated act of extreme violence against a victim who had opened his door in trust. On the 20th of March 2026, all three were sentenced to life imprisonment, with Donlin given a minimum term of 26 years. Maxwell was given a minimum term of 23 years, and Clegg was given a minimum term of 20 years. Next up is Elvis Vickers, who murdered Abdul Chadley and was sentenced on the 20th of March. On the 1st of November 2024, 48-year-old Elvis Vickers, a former soldier, murdered his neighbour, 48-year-old Abdul Chadley. That evening, both men who lived in adjacent flats had been drinking together at Vickers' home when they started to argue about current affairs. Just after 10 p.m, Vickers sent a text message to a friend which read, "Just to let you know, I've just killed Abs." 7 minutes later, Vickers called 999 and said, "I've got a dead body in my flat, mate," before telling the call handler, "Yeah, I killed him." Officers arrived to find Abdul Chadley, who was originally from Hertfordshire, with a single knife wound to his chest, and he died at the scene. When the police arrived, Vickers was caught on a police body camera as emergency services tried to save Abdul's life that society was bowing down to Muslims, as well as calling Abdul a wrong'un and who had pushed his luck. Vickers was arrested at the scene and can also be seen on body cam footage slumped against a wall and confessing through drunken slurred speech, "I know what I've done wrong. I'm prepared to take the fucking consequences." He was later charged with murder. Evidence produced at trial showed that Vickers had previously made threats to kill Abdul via text messages, which prosecutors argued demonstrated ongoing hostility and intent, not a sudden loss of control or the actions of someone defending themselves. Vickers stood trial at Norwich Crown Court, and on the 11th of December 2025, he was found guilty of murder. On the 20th of March 2026, Vickers was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years. Next up is Kalevi and Nivalda Pirjani, who murdered Miguel Pirjani and was sentenced on the 23rd of March. On the 24th of November 2024, 13-week-old Miguel Pirjani was admitted to Alderhay Hospital in Liverpool after his father, Clevi Pirjani, had called 999. During the call, Clevi Pirjani told the call handler that it just stopped breathing. On arrival at the scene, paramedics found Miguel in cardiac arrest and transferred him to the intensive care unit. Miguel was placed on a ventilator and was found to have sustained a severe and irreversible brain injury, as well as the discovery of a number of fractures to his body. Sadly, Miguel died 5 days later. Both Clevi and Nivalda Pirjani were arrested and questioned by police. They gave prepared statements and refused to answer questions in their police interviews. On the 21st of January 2025, both parents were charged with murder, as well as causing or allowing the death of a child, and grievous bodily harm with intent, a charge to reflect the abuse suffered by Miguel prior to his fatal injuries in late November of 2024. They stood trial at Liverpool Crown Court on the 6th of October 2025, having denied all charges. On the 9th of October 2025, Nivalda Pirjani pleaded guilty to causing or allowing the death of a child and gave evidence seeking to blame Clevi Pirjani for the murder of Miguel. Notwithstanding this change of plea on one charge, the case proceeded against both of them in relation to Miguel's murder. And on the 29th of October 2025, both of them were found guilty of Miguel's murder. On the 23rd of March 2026, Clevi Pirjani was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 19 years. Nivalda Pirjani was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 15 years and 3 months. Next up is Hugh Owen, who murdered Julian Hargreaves and was sentenced on the 23rd of March. On the 13th of March 2024, 40-year-old Hugh Owen attacked Julian Hargreaves in Julian's own home. The attack was described as being tortured after Julian was subjected to hours of abuse, being punched and kicked before being hit with a lamp and left unconscious on the floor. Julian was discovered the following day by his brother after remaining on the floor for over 14 hours. He was taken to hospital but died 3 weeks later on the 4th of April 2024. Before his death, Julian was able to name Owen as the person who had attacked him and left him on the floor before going on the run. CCTV footage later showed Owen near the scene appearing to be keeping an eye out on what was happening when police officers were present. Owen was arrested later on the 10th of April 2024 and was charged with murder. A second individual was also charged with Julian's murder. He stood trial at Leeds Crown Court along with that other individual. At the trial, it was revealed that Julian had medical vulnerabilities and pre-existing conditions, but evidence was called by the prosecution to argue that there was a direct and substantial link between the head trauma suffered by Julian at the hands of Owen, which had contributed to his death, with medical experts on behalf of the prosecution stating that the evidence showed that he had been unlawfully killed. And on the 20th of February 2026, Owen was found guilty of Julian's murder. His co-accused was found not guilty. On the 23rd of March 2026, Owen was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 17 years. Next up is Dale Cole, who murdered Lisa Holland and was sentenced on the 24th of March. On the 20th of October 2022, 39-year-old Lisa Holland was murdered by 39-year-old Dan Cole in the home that she shared with him. Prior to the murder, Lisa, who had been in a relationship with Cole for about 5 years, had been subjected to sustained and horrific abuse at Cole's hands, who was described as violent and controlling. After Cole attacked Lisa in October 2022, he simply left her and did nothing to help her until it was too late. When he rang 999 at 6:23 p.m, an hour and a half after evidence showed that she was unconscious, Lisa had already died. Cole told West Midlands Ambulance Service that his partner had fallen down the stairs. He was arrested a short time later on suspicion of Lisa's murder. Lisa was found to have had more than 40 broken ribs, including both old and new fractures, with at least 30 of those injuries inflicted over weeks and months prior to her murder, showing how she had been subjected to ongoing abuse. She also had serious abdominal injuries from prior assaults. Lisa's significant internal injuries caused by Cole were clearly too severe to have been caused by any kind of accidental fall down the stairs, as Cole had claimed. Cole denied killing Lisa, but pleaded guilty on the first day of the trial to manslaughter and controlling and coercive behaviour, as well as one count of inflicting grievous bodily harm. The trial continued, however, with the Crown Prosecution Service pursuing the charge of murder, together with 3 other counts of causing grievous bodily harm with intent, contrary to Section 18 of the Offences Against the Persons Act 1861. On the 20th of March 2026, the jury convicted Cole of all of the remaining charges, and on the 24th of March 2026, Cole was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 24 years. The final case in this video is not a sentencing for murder, but rather a resentencing and the increasing of a sentence following the murder of Alana Odessis by Shane March, who was originally sentenced on the 31st of October 2025 to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 42 years. In July 2024, Alana Odessis was found outside of her home in Walthamstow in the early hours with multiple stab wounds. Before losing consciousness, she identified her partner Shane March as the attacker. Alana had been in a short relationship with March, during which he was reportedly controlling and abusive. On the night of the incident, the couple argued and neighbours heard shouting and distress. At some point, March refused to let her back into the flat, where her young daughter was sleeping. Later, inside the flat, March attacked Alana with a kitchen knife, stabbing her at least 19 times and inflicting additional slashing injuries. Many wounds were defensive, showing that she tried to protect herself. She managed to get outside, where neighbours found her and called emergency services, but she died shortly thereafter. After the attack, March attempted to dispose of evidence, including the knife, clothing and mobile phones. He later entered a nearby cafe, made incriminating remarks and was arrested. He repeatedly admitted to killing both at the scene and in recorded messages. A post-mortem examination confirmed Alana suffered 23 sharp force injuries, several of which were individually fatal. Alana was also 7 to 8 weeks pregnant at the time of her death. Alana's other young daughter was found unharmed but left orphaned. March was already a convicted murderer, having been released from prison on a life licence in 2013 after fatally stabbing Andre Drummond, who was 17, in January of 2000. He was released in early 2013 and recalled to jail later that year after he was convicted of assaulting his then pregnant girlfriend, and was released again in February of 2018. March initially admitted manslaughter on the basis of diminished responsibility, but denied murder, but pleaded guilty partway through the trial. On the 31st of October 2025, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 42 years, avoiding a whole life order. Following his sentencing, the case was referred by the Solicitor General Ellie Reeves to the Court of Appeal under the unduly lenient sentence scheme for consideration as to whether the sentence would be increased. On the 26th of March 2026, Lord Justice Edis, sitting with Mr Justice Kavanagh and Judge Robinson, said, "The sentence was unduly lenient. We quash it, and we quash the minimum term order that the judge made, and substitute in its place a whole life order, which means that the offender will never be released." March now becomes one of around 80 people in England who are serving a whole life order. If you'd like to know more about others serving a whole life order and what they did, then please click the link to this video, which you can see on screen now. First up is John Boutland, who murdered Colleen Westerman and was sentenced on the 1st of April. On the 6th of November 2025, 57-year-old John Boutland murdered his partner, 62-year-old Colleen Westerman, in Melville Gardens in the Woodhouse area of Leeds. Grandmother Colleen was found at the address with at least 17 stab wounds after police were called when neighbours heard a disturbance at the property. Despite the arrival of emergency services, Colleen was pronounced dead at the scene. The background to the case was that Boutland was described as a functioning alcoholic who attacked Colleen in a ferocious and frenzied drunken rage after she told Boutland that she would leave him. Following the neighbours alerting the police, Boutland told the attending officers, "I've killed her. I admit everything." Boutland was arrested and charged with murder on the 8th of November 2025. At Leeds Crown Court, Boutland admitted to murdering Colleen, avoiding the need for a trial. On the 1st of April 2026, Boutland was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 15 years. The judge stated during sentencing, "You armed yourself with a knife and carried out this brutal attack on her, showing no mercy. You carried out this ferocious and frenzied attack intending to kill her. Such was the nature, number, and force and locations of the blows you struck to her. Your intentions may have been influenced by alcohol. However, a drunken intention is still an intention." Next up is Gavin Shaw, who murdered Michelle Kennedy and was sentenced on the 2nd of April. On the 13th of October 2025, 61-year-old Gavin Shaw attacked and killed his former partner, 55-year-old Michelle Kennedy, at her home in Manchester Road in Warrington. Shaw and Michelle had been in a long-term relationship, which friends and family described as volatile at times, and they separated in August of 2025. A few weeks before her murder, Michelle went on holiday to Turkey with her mother, where she met a man and began a new relationship. They continued seeing each other in the UK, and Michelle spent time with him the weekend before her death. Text messages found on Shaw's phone and comments he made to witnesses on the day of the murder showed that he had discovered Michelle's new relationship. On the 13th of October, Shaw consumed 5 pints in a local pub, and at around 4 p.m. he went to Michelle's home on Manchester Road, entering through the front door unannounced. Once inside, Shaw stabbed Michelle twice in the chest, causing serious injuries, before leaving the property. The whole incident lasted just 3 minutes. Michelle managed to leave the address but collapsed on the pavement outside. Shaw returned to his son's nearby home and told him that he had stabbed Michelle. Passing members of the public provided first aid at the roadside, located the knife and then moved it to a safe place and identified Shaw to the officers as the murderer. When police arrived, Shaw was immediately arrested. He responded by saying, "It was me, and that's what you get when she's shagging someone in fucking Manchester." He was subsequently charged with Michelle's murder. On the 23rd of March 2026, Shaw appeared at Liverpool Crown Court, where he pleaded guilty to Michelle's murder. On the 2nd of April 2026, Shaw was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 15 years. Next up is Harminder Mathu, who murdered Paramjit Kaur and was sentenced on the 2nd of April. On the 30th of March 2025, Harminder Mathu murdered his wife, 46-year-old Paramjit Kaur, in their home in Swan Crescent in Oldbury. The police were first alerted to this case the day after, on the 31st of March 2025, when Mathu went to West Bromwich Police Station at around 8 a.m. to tell officers that he had killed Paramjit, who was also known as Sonny. The police attended his property, where they discovered Paramjit's body. Mathu had told police that Paramjit had been drunk, had attacked him, and was armed with a knife. He stated that he had disarmed her and had ended up stabbing her in self-defence. A post-mortem examination was conducted on Paramjit's body, where it was determined that she was killed as a result of pressure on her neck, rather than as a result of a stab wound, where it was deemed likely that this had happened after she was already unconscious. In addition to this discovery, the police also learned that Paramjit was in the process of leaving Mathu, having filed for divorce 2 months earlier, following the breakdown of their 10-year marriage. Mathu had also previously been accused of domestic violence in December of 2024, but Paramjit refused to provide a statement to the police. Mathu had also grabbed her by the throat on another occasion, causing her to lose consciousness. Mathu was arrested and charged with murder. He stood trial at Wolverhampton Crown Court, where he maintained his defence of self-defence. The jury rejected this and convicted him of murder in late March of 2026. And on the 2nd of April 2026, Mathu was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 18 years. Next up is Jason Trundle, who murdered Leon Pratt and was sentenced on the 10th of April. On the 26th of October 2024, 64-year-old Leon Pratt was found dead, wrapped in a duvet at his home in Telford. Leon's body had remained undiscovered for at least 12 days. The culprit was 52-year-old Jason Trundle. Trundle was an unofficial carer for Leon, having moved into Leon's house around 18 months before the murder. Leon suffered from numerous health conditions and used a wheelchair and walking sticks for mobility, and Trundle, who had been homeless, provided care for Leon whilst being given a place to live. Neighbours became concerned about Leon after he went missing towards the end of September of 2024 and phoned the emergency services. Upon their arrival, the paramedics reported smelling rotten flesh coming from the property. Trundle told them that Leon had been dead for about 12 days, whilst pointing to a closed bedroom door, but he denied killing him. Leon had suffered injuries to his ribs, lower back, throat and neck, some of which were thought to have been caused by strangulation. Trundle was arrested and pleaded guilty to the offence of manslaughter. The Crown Prosecution Service rejected this plea and pursued a murder charge, with Trundle standing trial at Worcester Crown Court. Trundle had also pleaded guilty to preventing a lawful burial and fraud by false representation, as he used Leon's bank card after he had killed him. On the 9th of April 2026, the jury found Trundle guilty of Leon's murder, and on the 10th of April 2026, Trundle was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 19 years. Next up is Orrin Makepeace, who murdered Stephen Rothwell and was sentenced on the 10th of April. On the 18th of August 2025, 43-year-old Orrin Makepeace murdered her former partner, 41-year-old Stephen Rothwell, at his flat on Cross Street in Macclesfield. Makepeace, who was born male, had previously been in a relationship with Stephen after meeting him in prison around 12 years earlier. Although they had separated around 2023, they remained in contact and both had other partners. On the 15th of August 2025, Makepeace travelled from her home to stay with Stephen for several days. During her visit, tensions escalated after Stephen argued with an ex-girlfriend who had recently been unfaithful, with Makepeace also becoming involved in a confrontation. Later that evening, after police had earlier attended a disturbance and left, Makepeace stabbed Stephen once in the chest inside his flat. Rather than seeking help, Makepeace remained at the address overnight before leaving the following morning and returning to North Wales. Throughout the 18th of August, she contacted friends and admitted that she had killed Stephen, including sending a voice note stating, "I've murdered my boyfriend." At 10:19 p.m. that evening, Makepeace called 999 using a false name and falsely claimed that she was still at the scene, stating that she had stabbed Stephen in self-defence. Officers attended the address and found Stephen deceased with a single stab wound to the chest. Forensic evidence showed that the knife had been washed and placed in the kitchen, with Stephen's blood on the blade and Makepeace's DNA on the handle. Makepeace was arrested the following day. She later claimed that the stabbing was accidental during a struggle, but forensic evidence showed that this account was highly unlikely. Following a trial on the 25th of March 2026, Makepeace was found guilty of murder at Chester Crown Court, and on the 10th of April 2026, she was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 27 years. Next up is Dwayne Owusu, who murdered Zawa Mukhtar and was sentenced on the 14th of April. On the 16th of August 2025, 36-year-old Dwayne Owusu murdered 27-year-old Zawa Mukhtar after attacking her and throwing her from a car in Chadwell Heath in East London. Zawa, who was profoundly deaf and worked as a finance assistant at the Young Vic Theatre, had encountered Owusu and his group by chance after they attended a rave in Hackney. She joined the group as they travelled back towards Dagenham in an overcrowded Mercedes during the early hours of the morning. During the journey, Zawa had been drinking and taking drugs with the group. She became involved in an argument with two women in the car. The situation escalated after she began recording on her phone, leading Owusu to decide that she should be removed from the vehicle. After the driver stopped on Chadwell Heath Lane, Owusu grabbed Zawa's phone and threw it from the car before forcibly ejecting her onto the road. He then got out of the vehicle and attempted to kick her twice whilst she was on the ground. As one of the female passengers attempted to intervene and protect Zawa, Owusu pushed her aside before delivering a forceful blow to Zawa's neck, causing her to fall backwards and strike her head on the pavement. She suffered a fractured skull and fatal brain injuries. Witnesses later described Owusu as being consumed by rage, with one saying he looked like a monster. Despite Zawa lying unconscious in the road, Owusu ordered the others to leave her behind, shouting, "No one cares about her." The group drove away from the scene and were stopped by the police a short distance later, where officers recovered drugs from the vehicle and captured Owusu behaving aggressively on body-worn video footage. Passers-by soon alerted officers to Zawa lying injured nearby, but despite CPR attempts by police and paramedics, she was pronounced dead at the scene. CCTV footage later captured the fatal assault and also showed Owusu criticising another passenger for wanting to return and help Zawa, referring to him as a weak link. Owusu was arrested on the 17th of August 2025 and he gave a no-comment interview before being charged with murder the following day. He denied intentionally harming Zawa during his trial, claiming that he had only pushed her to de-escalate the situation, but this account was rejected by the jury. On the 5th of March 2026, he was found guilty of murder at the Old Bailey, and on the 14th of April 2026, Owusu was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 16.5 years. Next up is Simon Gebremedin, who murdered Marjama Osman and was sentenced on the 14th of April. On the 31st of May 2025, 34-year-old Simon Gebremedin murdered 26-year-old Marjama Osman at her home on Frith Road in Croydon. Gebremedin and Marjama were known to each other prior to the incident, and on the morning of the attack, he attended her flat where an argument took place between them. CCTV footage showed Gebremedin behaving aggressively outside the address, smashing his phone and banging on the door before being let inside by Marjama. Once inside the property, Gebremedin stabbed Marjama. She managed to flee the flat but collapsed outside, where she was found by a passer-by. Emergency services attended, but Marjama was pronounced dead at the scene from a single stab wound. Gebremedin was also present with a knife injury to his abdomen, but was taken to hospital before being arrested on suspicion of murder. He later claimed that he had acted in self-defence after being attacked by Marjama. However, CCTV evidence showed no sign of injury immediately after the incident. Investigators established that after he followed Marjama outside, Gebremedin returned to the flat where he is believed to have inflicted the wound on himself in an attempt to support his false account. Specialist evidence presented at trial concluded that the abdominal injury was likely self-inflicted. On the 1st of April 2026, Gebremedin was found guilty of murder at Inner London Crown Court, and on the 14th of April 2026, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 19 years. Next up is Sean Jefferson, who murdered Darcy Lee Jefferson and was sentenced on the 16th of April. On the 27th of March 2022, 31-year-old Sean Jefferson murdered his 7-week-old daughter, Darcy Lee Jefferson, at the home of her mother, Amy Clark. Jefferson and Amy Clark were in an on-off relationship when Amy became pregnant. Darcy Lee was Jefferson's only child. During the relationship, Jefferson heavily abused cannabis, with text messages showing that he prioritised obtaining and using the drug over caring for Amy and Darcy Lee. Jefferson and Amy lived separately, but he spent significant time at Amy's home and regularly cared for Darcy Lee alone. Within the first 2 weeks of Darcy Lee's life, Jefferson subjected her to the first serious assault. During an episode of anger, he violently squeezed Darcy Lee with such force that he fractured 3 of her ribs. Experts later described the injuries as consistent with a really violent squeeze. Despite knowing she was injured and in pain, Jefferson did not seek medical assistance. Jefferson's violence escalated significantly on the night of the 23rd of March 2022, while he was alone caring for Darcy Lee. After sending Amy messages complaining that the baby would not stop screaming, he lost his temper and carried out a second violent assault. During that attack, Jefferson forcefully squeezed and shook Darcy Lee, causing 34 rib fractures across the front, side and back of her rib cage, including fractures to her first ribs, as well as fractures to her left leg. Experts concluded that the injuries were caused by extreme squeezing and shaking. The following day, a health visitor noted Darcy Lee appeared distressed and observed bruising and dried blood around her mouth. Explanations provided by Amy were later found to have originated from Jefferson. Concerns were referred to social services, but no immediate safeguarding action was taken. Despite knowing that Darcy Lee had suffered serious injuries, Jefferson failed to seek medical treatment or pain relief for her. Instead, he sent bizarre text messages to work colleagues, falsely claiming that Darcy Lee was critically ill in hospital with internal injuries and might die. On the morning of the 27th of March, Jefferson carried out the fatal assault of Darcy Lee while preparing her bottle downstairs. He again lost his temper and violently squeezed and shook her with even greater force than before. Amy Clark heard Darcy Lee scream in pain before suddenly falling silent. Jefferson's assault caused a further 10 rib fractures, additional fractures to her right leg, and catastrophic brain injuries. Darcy Lee immediately lost consciousness and stopped breathing. Jefferson then called 999 and attempted CPR following instructions from call handlers. Paramedics and hospital staff attempted to save her life, but Darcy Lee died 2 days later on the 29th of March 2022. A post-mortem examination identified multiple additional injuries, including bruising and injuries inside her mouth. The court concluded that Jefferson had assaulted Darcy Lee on 3 separate occasions before her death. Following the fatal assault, Jefferson lied to police and medics, falsely claiming that Darcy Lee had suddenly collapsed without explanation. And during their trial, neither Jefferson nor Amy Clark chose to give evidence in their defence. On the 16th of March 2026, Jefferson was found guilty of murder, 2 counts of grievous bodily harm, and a further offence of causing or allowing the death of a child. And on the 16th of April 2026, Jefferson was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years. Amy Clark was found guilty of causing or allowing the death of a child and 2 counts of causing or allowing serious physical harm to a child relating to the earlier fractures suffered by Darcy Lee. Charges of murder and manslaughter against her were dropped during the trial, and she was found not guilty of 2 counts of grievous bodily harm with intent. She was sentenced to 7 years imprisonment. Next up is Jake McMillan, who murdered William Billy McNichol and was sentenced on the 23rd of April. On the 25th of December 2024, 17-year-old Jake McMillan murdered 63-year-old Billy McNichol at his home in Hawkthorne Drive in Ipswich. Billy, who lived alone with his dog Leo, was described by friends and neighbours as kind and friendly. McMillan knew Billy through drug dealing and had been supplying him with cannabis in the months leading up to the murder. On Christmas Day, McMillan travelled to Billy's home on an electric bike belonging to his father and remained at the address for around 2 hours. During that time, Billy suffered fatal head injuries and a stab wound to his right shoulder. His body remained undiscovered for a week until police were called to the property on New Year's Day after neighbours became concerned when Billy stopped responding and his dog could be heard howling inside his house. CCTV evidence showed that McMillan was the only person to enter the immediate area of Billy's home and remain there for a significant period on the day of the murder. Investigators also found bloody footprints on Billy's clothing and body that matched trainers McMillan was wearing in the CCTV footage. Fingerprints, palm prints and DNA matching McMillan were recovered from inside the property as well. Following the killing, McMillan dumped Billy's mobile phone in the River Orwell, with CCTV footage later capturing him travelling towards the Sir Bobby Robson Bridge shortly after leaving the address. The murder weapon and the clothes McMillan wore that day were never recovered. When first questioned by police, Macmillan denied any knowledge of Billy's death. After being rearrested months later, he claimed that he had entered the property only to collect a rucksack containing drugs and had found Billy already dead before panicking and leaving. The jury rejected his account, and on the 6th of February 2026, Macmillan was found guilty of murder at Ipswich Crown Court. On the 23rd of April 2026, Macmillan was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 14 years. Next up is Thomas Turner, who murdered Mandy Riley and was sentenced on the 28th of April. On the 4th of June 2025, 64-year-old Thomas Turner murdered his friend, 47-year-old Mandy Riley, at her flat in Harriet Tubman House in Normanton in Derby. Turner and Mandy were friends and had been drinking alcohol and smoking drugs together at her flat on the evening of the murder. Mandy was described by family as kind, welcoming and generous, often opening her home to others despite her own struggles. During the evening, Turner asked Mandy for money. Prosecutors at the trial stated that she refused, causing Turner to lose his temper and launch a violent attack. Turner stabbed Mandy 11 times in the neck while she sat on the sofa in her living room. After killing her, he stole money from her handbag and left the flat at around 10:30 p.m. CCTV footage later captured him using the stolen cash to buy alcohol and drugs. Following the murder, Turner attempted to cover his tracks by going to another friend's house in Duncan Road, where he washed his clothes before leaving without speaking to anyone. Mandy's body was discovered the following morning by a friend who had become concerned after she failed to answer calls ahead of a medical appointment. Police inquiries established that Turner had been the last person seen with Mandy alive. Forensic testing found Turner's DNA on Mandy's purse, while investigators also recovered a distinctive crack pipe belonging to Mandy among Turner's belongings. During police interviews, Turner refused to answer questions and denied responsibility for the killing. He was subsequently charged with Mandy's murder. On the 2nd of April 2026, Turner was found guilty of murder at Loughborough Crown Court, and on the 28th of April 2026, Turner was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 28 years. Next up is Philip Fraczek, who murdered Franklin Agbo Tui and was sentenced on the 28th of April. On the 15th of May 2024, 20-year-old Philip Fraczek murdered 79-year-old Franklin Agbo Tui at a block of flats on Plainstow Road in West Ham in East London. Fraczek, a Polish national with no fixed address, had entered the block of flats during the early afternoon and was seen trying multiple door handles before eventually falling asleep in a communal area. Franklin, a retired Merchant Navy veteran, described by family and neighbours as kind and gentle, confronted Fraczek and asked him to leave the building. Shortly afterwards, neighbours heard screaming and banging coming from Franklin's flat. Fraczek had launched a savage and unprovoked attack on Franklin, beating him so severely that broken furniture was later found scattered around the address. Officers and paramedics attended after police were called at around 3 p.m. and found Franklin suffering catastrophic injuries. Despite emergency treatment and being airlifted to hospital, he died 5 days later on the 20th of May 2024. Fraczek fled the scene but was spotted by a neighbour attempting to escape. Police officers pursued and arrested him 2 streets away on Gear Road. During the arrest, he headbutted one of the officers in the jaw. His knuckles and night trainers were found covered in Franklin's blood, with forensic testing later confirming the match. Fraczek subsequently pleaded guilty to murder and assaulting an emergency worker at Snaresbrook Crown Court, and on the 28th of April 2026, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years and 4 months. Next up is Leon Bangura, who murdered Calvin Taylor and was sentenced on the 30th of April. On the 15th of September 2024, 21-year-old Leon Bangura murdered 19-year-old Calvin Taylor at a flat in Lefroy Road, Norwich. Calvin, who was from London, had been staying at the address and dealing drugs from the flat from the Batman drug line. Bangura was associated with the rival Lenny line, and the court heard that tensions between the competing drug gangs led to the fatal attack. On the afternoon of the 15th of September, Bangura travelled to the flat with Adam Dugdale and Carrie Ann Hall. Evidence at trial showed the group intended to rob Calvin of drugs and money. When the occupants opened the door, the group forced their way inside. During the confrontation, Calvin produced a quantity of drugs and pointed towards cash hidden in a jacket. Bangura then stabbed him once in the chest with a large knife. Witnesses heard Bangura say, "It's done, let's get out of here," before fleeing the scene. Calvin died from the single stab wound, but his body remained undiscovered in the flat for almost a week. Police were eventually called to the address on the 21st of September after concerns were raised, where they found Calvin's body lying on the sofa in a state of decomposition. CCTV inquiries tracked Bangura travelling to and from the flat in a white Audi A3 believed to be an unlicensed taxi, before later returning to London. 4 days after the body was discovered, Bangura was arrested in Norwich while in possession of drugs and a knife. During police interviews, Bangura answered no comment to questions about the killing. At trial, the prosecutor said that the murders had been carried out during drug-dealing robberies connected to rival county lines operations. On the 8th of January 2026, Bangura was found guilty of murder at Norwich Crown Court. 2 co-defendants were acquitted of murder and manslaughter, while others accused in connection with the case were also cleared. On the 30th of April 2026, Bangura was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 30 years. First up is Nancy Pexton, who murdered Jennifer Abbott and was sentenced on the 1st of May. On the 10th of June 2025, 70-year-old Nancy Pexton murdered her sister, 69-year-old Jennifer Abbott, at Jennifer's flat in Mornington Place in Camden in North London. Jennifer, who was also known professionally as Sarah Steinberg, was a former film director and novelist who had previously lived in Los Angeles. Family members described long-standing tensions between the sisters, with evidence later revealing resentment and hostility from Pexton towards Jennifer over a number of years. Messages recovered by investigators showed Pexton had previously told Jennifer, "You know, I was planning to kill you," causing Jennifer to consider applying for a restraining order. On the morning of the 10th of June, Jennifer was captured on CCTV, returning home after walking her corgi called Prince. Later that day, Pexton travelled by bus to Jennifer's flat and stayed there for around an hour. Prosecutors said that during the visit, Pexton carried out a sustained and ferocious knife attack, stabbing and slashing Jennifer multiple times, particularly to the neck, before placing black tape over her mouth. Jennifer suffered catastrophic stab and slash wounds and died inside her living room. Pexton then stole Jennifer's diamond-encrusted gold Rolex watch, which had been gifted to Jennifer by her son and which relatives said she had never removed. Following the murder, Pexton left Jennifer's body undiscovered inside the flat for more than 3 days, while her dog Prince remained trapped in a bathroom without food. Concern was eventually raised by family members after Jennifer stopped responding to calls. On the 13th of June, a neighbour and Jennifer's niece forced entry into the flat, where Jennifer's partially decomposed body was found on the floor with severe injuries to her neck. Police inquiries established that Pexton was the last known person to see Jennifer alive. Officers later recovered Jennifer's gold Rolex from Pexton's belongings, along with blood-stained clothing and forensic evidence linking her to the killing. Detectives also discovered notes on Pexton's phone referring to plans to kill her evil sister. Pexton denied responsibility for Jennifer's death and claimed that she had only been looking after the Rolex watch. During the trial at the Old Bailey, prosecutors said jealousy and resentment towards her more financially successful sister formed part of the motive for the murder, and on the 29th of April 2026, Pexton was found guilty of murder. On the 1st of May 2026, Pexton was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years, with the judge concluding that Jennifer had suffered fear and pain before her death. Next up is Brandon Byrne, who murdered James Cook and was sentenced on the 1st of May. On the 30th of April 2025, 22-year-old Brandon Byrne murdered 40-year-old James Cook in Newark Town Centre in Nottinghamshire. James, a father of 3, had been drinking with friends and family in local pubs before attending the Loose Cannon pub on Stodman Street later that evening. Byrne arrived separately after arguing with his partner earlier in the night. Whilst inside the pub, an argument broke out between the two men after words were exchanged between the groups near a pool table. During the confrontation, Byrne was headbutted and bitten to the face by James, leaving him with significant facial injuries. Staff intervened and both men were removed from the pub through separate exits. CCTV footage later showed Byrne, who was already carrying a knife, leaving through the rear exit before walking around towards the front of the venue, looking for James. At around 11:50 p.m, Byrne spotted James on Stodman Street and chased him towards Castle Gate. Byrne then stabbed James before kicking him in the head as he fell injured to the ground. He proceeded to stab him a second time whilst he lay defenceless in the street. Byrne then walked away from the scene, leaving James with unsurvivable injuries. Despite the efforts of paramedics, James was pronounced dead shortly after midnight on the 1st of May. Byrne was identified and arrested at his home just hours later. During the arrest, captured on body-worn footage, he asked officers, "Did he die?" He later claimed that he had acted in self-defence, but the jury rejected his account. Byrne pleaded guilty to possessing an offensive weapon in public, but denied murder. On the 30th of April 2026, Byrne was found guilty of murder at Nottingham Crown Court, and on the 1st of May 2026, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 23 years. Next up is Adam Rosen, who murdered Alexis Denari and was sentenced on the 6th of May. On the 24th of June 2025, 26-year-old Adam Rosen murdered 45-year-old Alexis Denari inside a derelict building near the Shelton Water Tower in Shrewsbury. Alexis, a former head chef who had trained at the Prue Leith Cooking School and had previously worked at Claridge's and other high-end London restaurants, had struggled with alcoholism and homelessness in the years before his death. Alexis and Rosen first met outside the Royal Shrewsbury Hospital during the early hours of the 24th of June. Rosen, who was also homeless and struggling with addiction, offered Alexis somewhere to stay for the night at an abandoned building where he had been sleeping. CCTV footage later captured the pair walking together towards the disused property shortly before 4 a.m. At some point over the following hours, Rosen carried out what prosecutors described as a vicious and prolonged assault on Alexis. He suffered catastrophic blunt force injuries, including a traumatic brain injury and at least 17 fractured ribs, several of which were inflicted after his death. Rather than seeking help, Rosen left Alexis dying or dead inside the abandoned building and began using his bank cards to buy alcohol, food, clothes, scratch cards and travel tickets. CCTV footage later showed Rosen wearing a blood-stained sweatshirt whilst shopping in Shrewsbury town centre. Witnesses also recalled Rosen telling acquaintances words to the effect of, "I think I killed someone." Days later, he called 101, claiming he had discovered a dead body inside of the building. Emergency services attended and found Alexis's body concealed beneath a blood-stained sleeping bag in an attic room. Police inquiries quickly established that Rosen was the last person to see Alexis alive. Investigators recovered CCTV footage, financial evidence showing Rosen repeatedly using Alexis's bank cards after the killing, and witness accounts describing incriminating comments made by Rosen in the days after the murder. During the investigation, Rosen lied to emergency services and police about what had happened. On the 6th of April 2026, Rosen was found guilty of murder at Stafford Crown Court following a 12-day trial, and on the 6th of May 2026, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 16 years. Next up is Daniel Matos, Joshua Cowley and Keith Preddy, who murdered Tyler Donlin and were sentenced on the 7th of May. On the 24th of January 2024, 19-year-old Tyler Donlin was murdered in Hanworth Park in Feltham in West London after being ambushed by Daniel Matos, Joshua Cowley and Keith Preddy. Tyler, who was involved in local drug dealing through a county lines operation known as the John Line, had cycled to the park carrying heroin, crack cocaine and cash after drug users arranged to meet him there. Prosecutors said the murders took place against a backdrop of drug rivalry and serious violence linked to the drugs trade. Shortly before Tyler arrived, two drug users encountered Preddy along with Matos and Cowley inside the park. Witnesses described the trio as appearing hyped, with two of them carrying large knives and wearing face coverings. CCTV footage later captured the three men cycling to the park shortly before Tyler arrived at around 9:12 p.m. Over the next 5 minutes, Tyler was subjected to what prosecutors described as a sustained and targeted knife attack. He suffered multiple stab wounds, including a fatal wound to the neck. His body was discovered the following morning in thick grass near his bicycle by joggers. The investigation relied heavily upon CCTV footage, forensic evidence and GPS data from an electronic tag worn by Matos, which placed him at the exact location where Tyler was attacked. Detectives also recovered Tyler's blood on the sleeve of a hood found in Matos's bedroom, while Matos's DNA was identified on a cigarette recovered near the body. After the killing, CCTV footage showed the three men cycling away from the park before separating, with Matos later changing his clothes at a friend's address. When arrested 4 days later, all three denied ever meeting Tyler and made no comment during police interviews. A first trial at the Old Bailey collapsed after jurors failed to reach verdicts. However, following a retrial, Matos, Cowley and Preddy were all found guilty of murder on the 27th of February 2026. On the 7th of May 2026, the three men were sentenced to life imprisonment at the Old Bailey. Daniel Matos received a minimum term of 27 years and 6 months. Keith Preddy received a minimum term of 27 years, and Joshua Cowley received a minimum term of 25 years. Next up is Leighton Davis, who murdered Dale Brett Stogden and was sentenced on the 15th of May. On the 12th of August 2025, 28-year-old Leighton Davis murdered 50-year-old Brett Stogden in a drive-by shooting on Doncaster Road in Wakefield. Brett, a father of two, had recently been given the all clear after cancer treatment and was described by family members as a gentle giant who was much loved. On the evening of the murder, Davis was travelling in a stolen Toyota RAV4 with Adam Ahmed and Mark Carter as part of a group involved in drug dealing. CCTV footage and messages later showed that they had been driving around the area searching for two other men linked to rival drug activity. Brett was standing near a petrol station when the vehicle drove past before returning. Davis, who was sitting in the back of the car, armed with a converted firearm, fired a single shot from the moving vehicle, striking Brett. Brett had not been the intended target and instead was the victim of mistaken identity. He was taken to hospital but died shortly afterwards from the gunshot wound. Following the shooting, Davis and the others fled the scene. CCTV footage, vehicle tracking and mobile phone data later linked the group to the attack, establishing that they had deliberately gone out armed and searching for rivals. Davis was arrested and charged with murder, while his co-defendants were later convicted of manslaughter. After a trial at Leeds Crown Court, Davis was found guilty of murder in March of 2026, and on the 15th of May 2026, Davis was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 33 years. Ahmed and Carter had earlier been sentenced to 12 years each. Next up is Bekasani Mathiyaparanam, who murdered Luke Harden and was sentenced on the 18th of May. On the 1st of November 2025, 26-year-old Bekasani Mathiyaparanam murdered 37-year-old Luke Harden on Newchurch Road in Backup in Lancashire, shortly after both had attended a Halloween party at a working men's club in Staksted. Luke, a model and a DJ, had left the venue alone, whilst Mathiyaparanam left with a group of friends before separating from them moments before the attack. As Luke walked along Newchurch Road, he encountered Mathiyaparanam. During a brief interaction, Mathiyaparanam launched a sudden and violent assault, punching Luke before knocking him to the ground and repeatedly kicking and stamping on him as he lay defenceless. Luke suffered catastrophic head and neck injuries, with evidence showing he had no defensive wounds and had not been the aggressor. Following the attack, Mathiyaparanam failed to call for emergency assistance or provide any meaningful help. Instead, he used Luke's phone to call his friends and family to say he was lying on the ground, whilst falsely telling paramedics that Luke had simply fallen. A member of the public eventually called an ambulance and attempted first aid, but Luke died at the scene shortly after midnight. In the aftermath, Mathiyaparanam gave inconsistent accounts to police and attempted to evade justice. He was arrested at Manchester Airport the following day as he tried to board a flight out of the country. On the 13th of May 2026, Mathiyaparanam was found guilty of murder at Preston Crown Court. On the 18th of May 2026, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 16 years. Next up is Perry Allen Thomas and Amir Salem, who murdered Michals Sadio and were sentenced on the 20th of May. On the 22nd of May 2024, 26-year-old Perry Allen Thomas and 21-year-old Amir Salem murdered 44-year-old Michals Sadio in a drive-by shooting on Gifford Road in Willesden in northwest London. Michelle, a mother, had been attending a wake at her family home and was standing outside when she and others were shot. She had no connection to the attackers and was described by loved ones as a devoted parent. Allen Thomas and Salem were gang members who had armed themselves with a firearm and were driving around the area in a stolen vehicle looking for rival gang members. The intended target was said to have been a rapper called Trapstar Toxic, who was at the event. As the pair drove past, one of them fired multiple shots from the car towards the group gathered outside. Michelle was struck by gunfire and suffered fatal injuries, dying at the scene. The attack was later confirmed to be a case of mistaken identity, with Michelle entirely uninvolved in any criminality. Following the shooting, the pair fled the scene and later set fire to the vehicle in an attempt to destroy evidence. Children as young as 5 were in the crowd at the time of the shooting, in which 2 men were also injured. A detailed police investigation involving CCTV footage, mobile phone data and forensic evidence linked both men to the attack. Both were arrested and charged with murder. During the trial at the Old Bailey, the prosecution described the shooting as a planned gang attack carried out with complete disregard for human life. and on the 27th of March 2026, Alan Thomas and Salem were found guilty of murder. On the 20th of May 2026, both were sentenced to life imprisonment. Perry Allen Thomas received a minimum term of 36 years, while Amir Salem received a minimum term of 33 years. Next up is Alexander Nielsen, who murdered Anthony Priestley and was sentenced on the 21st of May. On the 17th of August 2025, 31-year-old Alexander Nielsen murdered 39-year-old Anthony Priestley in Coventry. Anthony was described by family and friends as kind, caring and devoted, with his death having a profound impact on those who knew him. The two men were not known to each other prior to the incident. During the evening of the 17th of August, Anthony encountered Nielsen in the street near Riley Square. What began as a brief interaction quickly escalated into violence. Nielsen launched a sustained and unprovoked attack, repeatedly punching and kicking Anthony, including whilst he was on the ground and defenceless. Witnesses described the assault as relentless and senseless, with Nielsen continuing to strike Anthony despite him offering no threat. Anthony suffered catastrophic head injuries as a result of the attack. Emergency services were called and he was taken to hospital, but despite medical treatment, he later died from his injuries. The court heard that the level of violence used was severe and wholly disproportionate, with no clear motive for the attack. Following the assault, Nielsen left the scene. Police inquiries, including CCTV footage and witness evidence, quickly identified him as the suspect and he was arrested. During police interviews and at trial, Nielsen denied intending to kill Anthony, but the evidence demonstrated the sustained nature of the attack. On the 1st of April 2026, Nielsen was found guilty of murder at Warwick Crown Court, and on the 21st of May 2026, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 19 years. Next up is Tanveer Singh, who murdered Shara Miller and was sentenced on the 27th of May. On the 11th of August 2024, 32-year-old Tanveer Singh murdered 41-year-old Shara Miller in Smethwick in the West Midlands. Shara, a vulnerable woman working as a sex worker, had been out that evening before getting into Singh's delivery van after he had been drinking and taking drugs. During the early hours, Singh drove Shara to an isolated industrial estate where he launched a violent attack inside of the van. He strangled her, causing fatal injuries in what prosecutors described as a sustained and brutal assault on a defenceless victim. Evidence showed that the attack took place in the confined space of the vehicle, with Shara unable to escape. After killing her, Singh then attempted to destroy evidence by pouring liquid over her body before removing her from the van and dumping her face down on the street. He then stole money from her before driving away. Shara was discovered by members of the public at around 6 a.m, but it was clear that she had already died. A post-mortem examination confirmed the cause of death as strangulation. Police inquiries using CCTV footage and vehicle tracking quickly identified Singh as the driver of the van. He was arrested and later admitted he knew Shara was dead when he left her, although he denied intending to kill her. During the trial at Wolverhampton Crown Court, the prosecution described him as having treated Shara as disposable. On the 15th of May 2026, Singh was found guilty of murder, and on the 27th of May 2026, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 29 years. Next up is Michael Doherty, who murdered Courtney Angus and was sentenced on the 28th of May. On the 25th of July 2025, 38-year-old Michael Doherty, also known as Michael Moore, murdered 21-year-old Courtney Angus at his home on Norfolk Street in Batley in West Yorkshire. Courtney, a young barmaid, had been staying at Doherty's address for several days, and evidence later showed that Doherty had developed an unwanted romantic interest in her. During the evening, Courtney rejected Doherty's advances. In response, he launched a prolonged and brutal attack inside of his home. He beat and strangled her, inflicting dozens of injuries in what prosecutors described as a sexually motivated and sadistic assault. The violence continued even after she was defenceless, and she died from the injuries inflicted. Following the murder, Doherty left Courtney's body inside his house and armed himself with a knife. He then went on a violent rampage in Dewsbury town centre, committing theft offences and threatening members of the public and the police. When arrested, he was confronted by officers and made threats whilst brandishing a weapon. During this sequence of events, he told police that there was a body at his home, leading officers to discover Courtney deceased at the address. Doherty was subsequently charged with murder as well as further offences relating to his conduct after the killing. He later pleaded guilty to murder at Leeds Crown Court, with the prosecution outlining the full extent of his violence and previous offending. On the 28th of May 2026, Doherty was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 33 years. Next up is Donald Exel, who murdered Rita Lambourne and was sentenced on the 28th of May. On the 12th of February 2025, 49-year-old Donald Exel murdered his cousin, 58-year-old Rita Lambourne, at her home in Bexhill-on-the-Sea in East Sussex. Exel and Rita had previously been on good terms, but their relationship deteriorated after Exel developed paranoid beliefs that members of the family were involved in a paedophile ring which he believed Rita was covering up. On the night of the murder, Rita was at home speaking on the phone to her partner when Exel approached the property carrying an axe. CCTV footage showed him calmly entering the house before launching a sudden and ferocious attack. He struck Rita at least 4 times with the axe, including a fatal blow to the chest that penetrated her heart. The attack lasted only a matter of minutes before Exel left the address. Rita's partner, who had been on the phone during the attack, raised the alarm after hearing the disturbance. Her body was discovered shortly afterwards by family members. Police inquiries uncovered CCTV footage, forensic evidence including Exel's DNA under Rita's fingernails, and items linked to the murder, such as an axe, clothing, and a sheath recovered from a submerged rucksack months later. Investigators also established that Exel had previously threatened to kill Rita following their earlier dispute. Exel denied responsibility during the investigation, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Following a trial, he was found guilty of murder. On the 28th of May 2026, Exel was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 31 years. Next up is Samuel Field, who murdered Martin Glynn and was sentenced on the 29th of May. On the 19th of September 2024, 40-year-old Samuel Field murdered his friend, 93-year-old Martin Glynn, at his flat in Desborough in Northamptonshire. Martin, a vulnerable pensioner, had been friends with Field for nearly 20 years and would regularly travel to visit him. He was described as trusting and independent despite his age. On the day of the attack, Martin had travelled by bus to Field's home. During the visit, Fields, fueled by paranoid delusions that his friend had betrayed him, launched a prolonged and brutal assault. Over a period of around 10 hours, he punched, kicked, stamped on and strangled Martin, repeatedly demanding a confession to an imagined conspiracy. The violence was described as sustained and torturous, leaving Martin with severe head injuries, broken bones and extensive bruising. Despite the seriousness of the injuries, Field did not immediately seek help. He delayed calling emergency services for more than 24 hours after the attack. When paramedics arrived, Martin was critically injured but still alive. He was taken to hospital, where he survived for several months before dying on the 26th of December 2024 from the injuries inflicted during the assault. Before his death, Martin was able to identify Field as his attacker. Following the attack, police inquiries established the extent of the violence through medical evidence and witness evidence. Field admitted carrying out the assault but denied murder. However, the sustained nature of the attack and the level of force used demonstrated clear intent, so said the prosecution. After an 11-day trial at Northampton Crown Court, he was found guilty of murder on the 6th of May, and on the 29th of May 2026, Field was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years. Next up is Yuri Mazyka, who murdered Helena Hoysan and was sentenced on the 29th of May. On the 27th of August 2025, 34-year-old Yuri Mazyka murdered his ex-girlfriend, 29-year-old Helena Hoysan, at her flat in Greenwich, southeast London. Helena, a mother, had ended the relationship months earlier and had obtained a non-molestation order after enduring controlling and abusive behaviour by Mazyka. Despite this, Mazyka continued to stalk and harass her, even placing a tracking device inside their young child's scooter to monitor her movements. On the day of the murder, Helena was at home with another man when Mazyka forced entry into the flat armed with a knife. In a planned and sustained attack, he stabbed her multiple times to the chest. The assault took place in the presence of her young child and the other man, who fled to call emergency services as the attack unfolded. Helena suffered fatal injuries and was pronounced dead at the scene. Following the attack, Mazyka took photographs and filmed Helena as she lay dying before he stabbed himself. Evidence later recovered from his phone showed that he had researched violent methods and fixated on Helena after learning she had begun a new relationship. The court heard that the killing was driven by jealousy and possessiveness in breach of the court order designed to protect her. Mazyka was arrested and charged with murder and possession of a bladed article. During the trial at the Old Bailey, the prosecution described his actions as calculated and obsessive, highlighting the sustained nature of the violence. On the 29th of May 2026, Mazyka was found guilty of murder, and on the same day he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 30 years. Judge Simon Mayo KC told Mazyka, "In killing Helena, you robbed your young daughter of her mother just days before her 4th birthday. You knew your child would be present in the flat when you arrived. That knowledge did not deter you. That is a matter of particular gravity. I am sure your actions were driven by jealousy, resentment, and the determination to exert control over Helena even after your relationship had come to an end." First up is Vikram Digwa, who murdered Henry Nowak and was sentenced on the 1st of June. On the 3rd of December 2025, 22-year-old Vikram Digwa murdered 18-year-old Henry Nowak on Belmont Road in Southampton. Henry, a first-year university student, had been walking back to his accommodation after an evening out. He was described by his family as kind, hard-working and ambitious, and was the first in his family to attend university. Digwa and Henry were strangers, and their meeting was entirely by chance. Shortly after 11 p.m, Henry and Digwa passed each other on Belmont Road. Digwa, who was carrying a large ceremonial Sikh dagger called a kirpan, approached Henry after Henry jokingly asked whether he was a bad man whilst filming him on his phone. Digwa responded that he was a bad man before grabbing Henry's phone. A brief struggle followed, during which Digwa's turban may have been knocked off, although that was never made clear. Digwa became angry at what he perceived to be disrespect before drawing the dagger and deliberately stabbing Henry 4 times, including a fatal wound to the chest that pierced his lungs and severed a major vein. Henry also suffered stab wounds to his leg and groin and slashes to his face, leaving him defenceless. Despite knowing Henry had been critically injured, Digweed showed a callous disregard for his well-being. He filmed Henry as he desperately tried to escape over a fence before collapsing, before falsely insisting that he had not been stabbed. Digweed then lied to his brother, his parents and the police, claiming that Henry had racially abused and attacked him. He instructed his mother to remove and hide the murder weapon, kept hold of Henry's phone containing the recording of the confrontation between the pair, and later agreed with his brother to falsely claim self-defence. His lies misled attending officers into initially treating Henry as the aggressor, resulting in Henry being arrested and handcuffed before his condition rapidly deteriorated. Despite telling the officers that he had been stabbed, the arresting officer remarked, "I don't think you have, mate." It was only later that they realised in fact Henry was telling the police the truth. Henry then sadly died at the scene. Digweed was subsequently charged with murder, and during police interviews and at trial he maintained that he had acted in self-defence, but the jury rejected his account. On the 14th of May 2026, he was found guilty of murder at Winchester Crown Court, and on the 1st of June 2026, Digweed was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 21 years. Following the sentencing, the Solicitor General Ellie Reeves referred Digweed's sentence to the Court of Appeal under the unduly lenient sentence scheme, and the Court of Appeal will now decide whether the minimum term imposed was too low and whether it should be increased. There was also widespread scrutiny of the police response, when the sentencing remarks and the released body-worn footage showed that when officers had arrived, they accepted Digweed's false claims that he had been the victim of a racist attack. Henry, despite repeatedly saying that he had been stabbed and was dying, was handcuffed and initially treated as a suspect. The footage prompted widespread public criticism and led to an investigation by the Independent Office for Police Conduct into Hampshire Police's handling of the incident. Hampshire Police subsequently apologised to Henry's family, and the arresting officer also resigned from the police force. The behaviour of the attending police officers is still currently under investigation. The case also prompted broader debate about the religious exemption allowing Sikhs to carry a kirpan, although the trial judge made it clear that the weapon that Digweed used was not a traditional kirpan, but a much larger knife that was inconsistent with its intended religious purpose. Public anger over both the killing and the police response led to protests in Southampton, some of which turned violent, resulting in numerous arrests and later convictions for violent disorder. Henry's family had appealed for calm and asked that their son's death should not be used to divide communities. Next up is Clifton George, who murdered Annabel Rook and was sentenced on the 9th of June. On the 17th of June 2025, 45-year-old Clifton George murdered his long-term partner, 46-year-old Annabel Rook, at their home on Dummont Road in Stoke Newington in North London. George and Annabel had been in a relationship for around 10 years and lived together in the property. Annabel was the co-founder of a refugee charity called Mama Sue's, and she had become increasingly fearful of George's controlling and abusive behaviour. In the weeks before her death, she confided in family and friends that she intended to end the relationship and described George as being on the warpath. During the evening of the 17th of June, an argument broke out after Annabel told George that their relationship was over. George responded with extreme violence, repeatedly punching and attempting to strangle Annabel before arming himself with a kitchen knife. He then stabbed Annabel 31 times, inflicting fatal wounds to her chest, abdomen and neck. After killing her, George attempted to destroy the scene by setting fire to the basement and igniting a gas canister. The resulting explosion tore through the house, causing extensive damage to neighbouring properties and placing nearby residents and emergency services at significant risk. George escaped from the burning building before the explosion occurred. Emergency services then discovered Annabel's body inside the devastated property after extinguishing the fire. George was found nearby with injuries and he was arrested. During the investigation, he admitted killing Annabelle, but claimed he had lost self-control after she told him that she was leaving him. George was subsequently charged with murder and arson with intent to endanger life. During his trial at Snaresbrook Crown Court, he admitted manslaughter and arson, but denied murder on the grounds of loss of control. On the 3rd of June 2026, the jury rejected his defence and found him guilty of murder. And on the 9th of June 2026, George was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 23 years. Next up is Julian Thomas, who murdered Anne-Marie Green and was sentenced on the 12th of June. On the 27th of September 2025, 55-year-old Julian Thomas murdered his former partner, 61-year-old Anne-Marie Green, at her home in Appletree Close in Bromyard in Herefordshire. Thomas and Anne-Marie had previously been in a relationship which had ended, but he had continued to visit her home. In the months before her death, Thomas had subjected Anne-Marie to domestic abuse, including an assault on the 10th of July 2025, to which he later pleaded guilty. During the evening of the 26th of September, Thomas visited Anne-Marie at her home. At some point during the night, he launched a sustained and violent attack, repeatedly striking her with a blunt object and causing severe head and chest injuries. The assault left Anne-Marie with catastrophic injuries, from which she died inside her home. Thomas then left the address, leaving her body undiscovered. Anne-Marie's body was discovered the following morning after emergency services were called to the property, and a post-mortem examination confirmed that she had died from blunt force injuries to her head and chest. Police inquiries quickly identified Thomas as the prime suspect, and he was arrested before being charged with murder. The case also prompted an independent Office for Police Conduct investigation into previous police contact with Thomas and Anne-Marie before her death. Thomas subsequently admitted murdering Anne-Marie and pleaded guilty to both murder and the earlier assault. His guilty plea spared Anne-Marie's family of the ordeal of a trial. And on the 12th of June 2026, Thomas was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 19 years. Next up is Sarah Ngaba, who murdered Eliza Ngaba and was sentenced on the 12th of June. On the 13th of November 2019, 25-year-old Sarah Ngaba murdered her 7-week-old daughter, Eliza Ngaba, at their home in Brookside in Telford. Eliza was a healthy baby until Ngaba lost control and subjected her to a sustained and brutal assault. Ngaba violently shook Eliza and struck her with significant force, causing a fractured skull, catastrophic brain injuries, retinal hemorrhages, spinal cord bleeding, and extensive bruising. Although Eliza survived the assault, she was left with permanent and profound disabilities that ultimately led to her death almost 3 years later. On the morning of the assault, a friend video-called Ngaba and could see that Eliza was physically shaking. He urged her to call an ambulance immediately, but Ngaba instead took a bath before booking a taxi, despite being told that none was available for almost an hour. CCTV footage showed that before travelling to the hospital, she stopped at a nearby shop to buy a lottery ticket. When she arrived at the Princess Royal Hospital, she went through triage rather than directly to accident and emergency. Medical staff quickly identified the seriousness of Eliza's injuries, and she was transferred to Birmingham Children's Hospital. During the investigation, Ngaba repeatedly changed her account, initially blaming a walking stick, then Eliza's father, before eventually admitting that she had lost control and struck her daughter. It was concluded that she had shown significant presence of mind in attempting to conceal what she had done and had demonstrated no genuine urgency to obtain medical treatment for Eliza. Following the assault, Eliza was removed from Ngaba's care and placed with foster parents Laura and Gary Haynes, who cared for her until her death. Eliza developed severe cerebral palsy, epilepsy, profound visual impairment and swallowing difficulties, requiring tube feeding and repeated hospital admissions. Despite her disabilities, she was described as a content and affectionate child who thrived in the love of her foster family. On the 15th of August 2022, aged almost 3, Eliza died from a respiratory infection. Medical experts concluded that she would not have died had Ngaba not inflicted the devastating brain injuries which left her medically vulnerable. The judge found that the injuries inflicted in 2019 made a significant contribution to her death. Ngaba had previously been convicted in 2021 of causing grievous bodily harm with intent and had been sentenced to 14 years imprisonment. Following Eliza's death, she was charged with murder. At trial, Ngaba admitted causing the injuries but pleaded guilty to infanticide, claiming that she had been suffering from a disturbance of the mind following childbirth. The jury rejected that defence, and on the 21st of May 2026, she was found guilty of murder. The judge found during sentencing that Ngaban's actions were driven not by mental illness, but by an inability to control her anger, and noted that she had never shown genuine remorse for what she had done. On the 12th of June 2026, Ngaba was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 13 years, reflecting time already served for her earlier conviction. In sentencing, the judge concluded that Eliza endured a lifetime of suffering as a direct result of the brutal assault inflicted by the person who should have protected her, and he praised her foster parents for the exceptional love and care they gave her through her tragically short life. Next up is James Ritchie, who murdered Anthony Wilson and was sentenced on the 15th of June. On the 15th of March 2025, 51-year-old James Ritchie murdered 50-year-old Anthony Wilson and attempted to murder 50-year-old Darren Pearson at a house on Newcombe Road in Earlsdon in Coventry. Anthony and Darren were together inside the property when Ritchie arrived. The court heard that there had been no obvious provocation for what followed, and investigators were never able to establish a clear motive for the attack. Shortly before 2 p.m, Ritchie launched a sudden knife attack on both men using a box cutter style blade. Anthony suffered catastrophic wounds to his neck and died at the scene despite the efforts of emergency services. Darren was also repeatedly attacked, sustaining serious neck and facial injuries, but survived after receiving urgent hospital treatment. The judge later found that Ritchie had intended to kill both men during the assault. Following the attack, Ritchie left the address and walked into Coventry Central Police Station, where he told officers, "I think you're looking for me. Yes, it was me. I did it." Detectives recovered the murder weapon and gathered CCTV footage, forensic and witness evidence linking him to the stabbing. Although Ritchie admitted carrying out the attacks, he denied intending to murder Darren, leading to a separate trial on the attempted murder charge. The jury in the first trial could not reach a verdict on that charge, but on the 9th of June 2026, following a retrial at Warwick Crown Court, he was found guilty of attempted murder, having already admitted Anthony's murder and a charge of wounding Darren with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. On the 15th of June 2026, Ritchie was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 28 years and 4 months. Next up is Charlie Jeans, who murdered Samantha Murphy and was sentenced on the 17th of June. On the 4th of June 2025, 31-year-old Charlie Jeans murdered his partner, 32-year-old Samantha Murphy, at her home on Wadham Road in Portsmouth. Samantha, a devoted mother of 3, had been in a relationship with Jeans, and the pair had spent the evening together drinking at a local pub. CCTV footage later showed them walking back towards Samantha's home shortly before midnight. Shortly after the couple arrived home, neighbours heard a man shouting, "I'm going to kill you," followed by Samantha screaming. Inside the property, Jeans launched a violent attack, killing Samantha before remaining inside the address for more than an hour. At around 12:20 a.m, he sent a text message to his mother stating, "I'm going to be in prison for a very long time. I love you." At approximately 1:40 a.m, doorbell footage captured him leaving the house alone. Rather than seeking help, Jeans went into hiding, leaving Samantha's body undiscovered until the following morning when emergency services were called to the address. Police inquiries, including CCTV footage, mobile phone evidence and witness accounts, quickly established Jeans's movement before and after the murder. Detectives traced him after he spent 4 days avoiding capture and arrested him. During the investigation, Jeans initially denied murdering Samantha and pleaded not guilty, forcing her family to endure the start of a murder trial. However, on the 5th day of proceedings at Portsmouth Crown Court, confronted by the overwhelming evidence against him, he changed his plea and admitted responsibility for Samantha's death. On the 17th of June 2026, having pleaded guilty to Samantha's murder on the 15th of June 2026, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 17 years. Next up is Jamie Varley, who murdered Preston Davey and was sentenced on the 18th of June. On the 27th of July 2023, 37-year-old Jamie Varley murdered 13-month-old Preston Davey at the home that he shared with his partner, John McGowan Faza Curley. Preston had been placed with the couple 4 months earlier as part of the adoption process. Before entering their care, he had been a healthy and thriving little boy. During his time living with the couple, however, Varley repeatedly abused Preston, inflicting numerous physical injuries whilst also sexually abusing him. The court heard that Preston had become increasingly withdrawn and distressed in the weeks before his death. On the afternoon of the 27th of July, whilst alone with Preston, Varley carried out a final attack. He sexually assaulted Preston before deliberately obstructing his airway, causing him to stop breathing. Instead of immediately seeking emergency help, Varley delayed calling for assistance and later falsely claimed that Preston had accidentally drowned in the bath. Medical experts found no evidence of drowning and concluded that Preston had died from deliberate airway obstruction. A post-mortem examination also revealed dozens of recent and older injuries, demonstrating that the fatal assault was the culmination of months of abuse. The investigation uncovered extensive evidence of Varley's offending. Digital examinations recovered indecent images and videos of Preston, together with messages and internet activity that exposed Varley's sexual interest in children. Detectives also established that Preston had suffered repeated assaults whilst living with the couple. Throughout the investigation and subsequent trial, Varley denied murdering or sexually abusing Preston, maintaining that his death had been a tragic accident, but the jury rejected his account. His partner, McGowan Faza was acquitted of murder, but was convicted of causing or allowing Preston's death, child cruelty and sexual assault after failing to protect him from clear signs of abuse. Varley was subsequently convicted of murder, multiple child cruelty offences, grievous bodily harm and numerous sexual offences against Preston, as well as other indecent images offences. On the 18th of June 2026, Varley was sentenced to life imprisonment with a whole life order. In passing sentence, the judge concluded that Varley had subjected Preston to sustained physical and sexual abuse before murdering him, describing his crimes as so exceptionally grave that he should never be released from prison. McGowan Faza was sentenced for his part to 25 years in prison. Next up is Mark Fellows, Lee Newell and David Taylor, who murdered Kyle Bevan and was sentenced on the 19th of June. On the 4th of November 2025, 45-year-old Mark Fellows, 57-year-old Lee Newell and 64-year-old David Taylor murdered fellow prisoner 33-year-old Carl Bevan inside his cell at HMP Wakefield. Bevan was serving a life sentence for murdering 2-year-old Lola James in 2020. The three defendants deliberately chose Bevan as their target because of his convictions for murdering a child and planned the attack in advance by making or obtaining improvised bladed weapons. Shortly after 5:30 p.m, CCTV footage captured Bevan entering his cell, with fellows Newell and Taylor following him inside seconds later. Over the next 4 minutes and 39 seconds, the three men carried out a coordinated and sustained attack, cornering Bevan in a confined space and stabbing him at least 25 times with improvised weapons, including sharpened pieces of metal removed from the back of a television. Each defendant played an active part in the killing. Bevan suffered multiple wounds to his neck and body, including injuries that penetrated his heart and major blood vessels, causing catastrophic blood loss. After the attack, the three men placed Bevan's body in his bed and covered him with bedding to make it appear as though he was asleep before they calmly left the cell together. The attack went undiscovered until the following morning, when prison staff found Bevan dead in his cell. CCTV footage showed the three men returning to their own landing in what the prosecution described as a job done mood, with congratulations exchanged between inmates after words of the killing had spread throughout the prison. During the investigation, none of the defendants provided any explanation for their actions. Fellows Newell and Taylor were subsequently charged with Bevan's murder. Now, during the trial at Leeds Crown Court, all three denied murder, but on the 18th of June 2026, they were found guilty by a jury. On the 19th of June 2026, all three men were sentenced to life imprisonment with whole life orders. In sentencing, the judge found that the murder had been carefully planned and motivated by vigilantism rather than any immediate threat, describing it as a calculated execution carried out against a defenceless victim in the highest security prison in the country. Fellows and Newell were already serving whole life orders and feature in my Every UK Prisoner Serving a Whole Life Order video, which there should be a link at the top of this video if you want to check it out. Next up is Bradley Nightingale, who murdered Jake Mills and was sentenced on the 19th of June. On the 16th of September 2025, 29-year-old Bradley Nightingale murdered his friend, 34-year-old Jake Mills, at Jake's flat on the High Street in Cheslenhay in Staffordshire. Jake and Nightingale were known to each other and had spent time together at the flat during the early hours of the morning. Jake was a father and was described by his family as kind, caring and deeply loved. At some point inside the flat, Nightingale launched a violent attack on Jake, stabbing him once in the neck and inflicting a fatal injury. He then left Jake dying inside his home before stealing his Audi A5 car, mobile phone, bank card and other personal belongings. CCTV footage captured Nightingale leaving the flat and driving away in Jake's car. Shortly afterwards, he crashed the vehicle and then fled the scene on foot. Rather than seeking help for his friend, Nightingale used Jake's bank card to pay for bus travel, attempted to buy alcohol, tried to contact Jake's bank, and later sold Jake's mobile phone to a second-hand retailer. Jake's family became concerned when they were unable to contact him. On the 18th of September, after he had been reported missing, officers forced entry into his flat and discovered his body. A post-mortem examination confirmed that he had died from a stab wound to his neck. Detectives quickly identified Nightingale through CCTV footage, forensic inquiries, and his movements after the killing. During police interviews, Nightingale claimed that Jake had given him permission to use the car and denied causing him any harm, before answering no comment to further questions. Following a trial at Stoke-on-Trent Crown Court on the 14th of May 2026, he was found guilty of Jake's murder. And on the 19th of June 2026, Nightingale was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 17 years.